What's up guys, this is your favorite fanfic YouTuber, the Fanfic Majesty, and welcome to another amazing video. You can follow me on Patreon for exclusive stories. 6 Pi Chapter 66 Arrival. The Afro fighter who was walking with him, also known as Chromolimon, also stopped quickly. He turned to look at Jess and asked, "What's wrong?" Jess stared at the sea outside the harbor without looking back. "That guy Hawkeye is here again." Chromolimon shook his body, turned his head quickly, followed Jess' gaze, and looked out of the harbor, only to see the sparkling sea in the distance, and on the sea level, a group of black shadows was rapidly approaching here. When he saw Xiaozhou's appearance clearly, his whole face collapsed. In the past few months, Mahawk has come to Magnetic Drum Island from time to time. Every time he came, he would live in the palace on Sigu Mountain for a few days, as if the palace was his home. At first they resisted, but after being cleaned up by Mahawk, it's all honest. Even their king, Wapple, keeps away every time he sees this guy. He quickly turned around and looked up at Wapple on the hippo. "Your Majesty, that fellow Hawkeye is here again." Waple's happy face froze, and he quickly looked around. Where? Out there on the sea. Wapple quickly looked out of the harbor. When he saw the familiar figure, he let out a big breath, then turned around, clamped the hippopotamus with his legs, and patted the hippopotamus' neck with both hands. "Robson, go. He didn't want to meet that Hawkeye guy. That guy has bullied him miserably these past few months. Not only occupied his palace, but also occupied his food." Hiss. Robson, the furry hippopotamus Wapple was riding, threw his head back and let out a cry. Then he lowered his head, sprayed 2 puffs of white air from his nose, and stepped forward quickly. Seeing the hippopotamus running past, Chromolimon and Jess quickly turned around and followed. Advertisement: they're going to the Holy Land Marijoy soon. "Hawkeye, come here, this time they won't have to face this terrifying monster." After a while, Wapple and his crew all boarded the Iron King. As soon as these guys boarded the ship, they quickly hid in the cabin, leaving only a few necessary sailors who started the ship. Mahawk's small boat sailed slowly into the harbor, and passed between Marine's warship and the Iron King, while the people on the boats on both sides looked at Mahawk without making a sound. Beside the military ship, the young Rear Admiral looked down at Mahawk, his pupils constricted slightly, and his face was serious. Although he knew that Hawkeye was nearby, he never thought that he would meet him so easily. Looking at the small boat below, he routinely asked loudly, "Hawkeye Mahawk, why are you here?" Hearing the shout, Mahawk raised his head and put his hand on the brim of his hat that covered his vision, revealing a pair of eagle-like sharp eyes with yellow pupils underneath. He calmly stared at the young Rear Admiral on the warship and said, "How'd I act and report to your Marine?" As he spoke, his eyes narrowed slightly. "Pay attention to your identity, Marine." Staring into Mahawk's eyes, the young Rear Admiral suddenly felt as if 2 sharp swords were being shot at him, and profuse sweat quickly broke out from his forehead. He was startled by Hawkeye's sudden gaze, but no matter what he said, he was a Rear Admiral. Even if he was facing 7 warlords of the sea, the #1 swordsman in the world, he was not afraid, because behind him was the entire marine system, the world government. He clenched his fists, stared at Mahawk, and said loudly, "I don't care what you do around here, although I can't control you, and Marine can't control you, but don't forget, your identity, don't do it something that endangers the world." Mahawk ignored the young Rear Admiral, lowered his head, and the boat continued to move forward. What? At this moment, Mahawk stood up suddenly and turned to look outside the harbor. "What's wrong?" The people on both sides of the boat who had been staring at Mahawk all backed away when they saw Mahawk's sudden movement. They were relieved to see that Mahawk didn't do anything else. Then his face turned red, and he was ashamed of his subconscious retreat just now. But when they saw that the people around him were the same as themselves, they exhaled in unison, their expressions returned to normal, they took a step forward, lying on the guardrail, their heads turned to the sea, and they all wanted to see what could attract Mahawk's attention. The young Rear Admiral also turned his head, looking at the small sailboats coming towards him on the sea in the distance, with doubts in his eyes. But when Li Kei entered and saw clearly what kind of flag was fluttering in the wind on the top of the mast, his expression could no longer remain calm. Advertisement. How come? How come? How come? The expression on his face suddenly changed, his pupils shrank into a single point, and cold sweat kept pouring out from all parts of his body, soaking his clothes after a while. He is not afraid of Mahawk, because Mahawk is the 7 warlords of the sea, equivalent to their marine ally, and also belongs to the world government. But a group of pirates with a bounty of more than 2 billion, or the pirates who seriously injured 4 vice-admirals in the Buster Call and left safely, are worthy of his fear. Although he had never heard the news that the silver-haired group would harm Marine, the innate threat brought by the hostile forces still made him unable to stop the fear in his heart. "What's the matter, Master Rear Admiral?" The deputy next to him noticed Rear Admiral's state and quickly turned his head. Rear Admiral reacted and suppressed the horror in his heart. As a Marine who regards justice as his belief, the moment he joined the Marine, he had already considered that when facing any pirate, he would. What kind of situation did you encounter? Although he is young, although he is afraid, although this is his first voyage after becoming a Rear Admiral, but... Looking at his deputy and the Marine soldiers on the warship with concern, he raised his head and looked at the seagull flag fluttering high on the top of the warship's mast. The fear in my heart disappeared. They are Marines, and they are pirates. How can there be a saying that Marines are afraid of pirates? Fine. He lowered his head, looked at the deputy, touched the sweat on his forehead, and smiled slightly. It seems that he has grown a lot in an instant. Then the smile on his face faded away. He raised his head, glanced across the deck, and shouted loudly. Everyone cheer up, the silver-haired pirates are here. Silver hair. The deputy and the marine soldiers on the deck all turned their heads, looked at Rear Admiral, their eyes widened, their faces were full of disbelief, and then they messed up instantly. That's the silver hair pirates. That's the world's top pirate group walking sideways in the first half of the Grand Line. Unexpectedly, let them run into each other. Looking at the subordinates in a mess, Rear Admiral opened his mouth and shouted loudly. Why are you panicking? Don't forget what you are Marines for, please be quiet. Hearing the sound, the marine soldiers paused, as if they had found their backbone, and the fear in their eyes gradually turned into firmness. They have listened to the old marine countless times, telling how they faced the big pirate when they were young, and how they were fearless in front of the big pirate. Now it's their turn. They can't be sorry for the clothes they are wearing, the clothes that represent marine injustice. If they are even afraid, who will protect the countless civilians standing behind them? Isn't this exactly what they have been facing and will face when they join Marine? Chapter 67. Stupid. Seeing that his subordinates were all quiet, Rear Admiral quickly issued an order. Get ready for shelling. Even if the silver-haired pirates are on the opposite side, we must fight resolutely. He paused, then raised his head and shouted, Are you afraid? Not afraid. The marine soldier stared at Rear Admiral, puffed out his chest, his eyes were full of determination. It is good. Rear Admiral glanced at the many subordinates, with the corners of his mouth upturned, and laughed loudly. I feel your emotions. With this spirit, I believe that we will be able to defeat any pirates and any evil. As he spoke, he raised his hand and shouted, In the name of absolute justice, act. To understanding. The marine soldiers gave a military salute to Rear Admiral, turned around and got busy. After a while, countless holes opened on the hulls on both sides of the warship amidst a rumbling sound, and huge cannon barrels protruded from the inside. At the same time, under the power system of the ship's own hull, Junhang quickly turned its direction, and the side that protruded from the barrel was aimed at the open sea. The warship on which the Marine General-level non-commissioned officer rides is specially designed by the World Government Science Department, Vegapunk. It not only has a power system that can sail without borrowing wind power, but also has a sea stone on the bottom of some warships that need to go out and about. A rare stone that restrains demon fruit power. Mahawk ignored Marine beside him. His eyes were fixed on the Liberty in the distance from the beginning to the end, and on the white figure in a moon-white robe on the bow of the Liberty. It made me wait so long, silver-haired Sorata. In the past few months, he basically visited the waters near Sigu Island. If he hadn't seen the news that Yinfa appeared elsewhere, he couldn't help but wonder if Bada had deceived him. However, he still believed in his instinct in the end. Instead of going back to Bath, he went to look for Bada. As the Liberty got closer, his eyes became more and more fierce, and an expression of excitement appeared on his always calm face. Looking at Sorata, feeling the unique sharpness of the great swordsman on Sorata, it gave him the feeling of facing the red-haired Shanks a few years ago. How long has it been since he felt this exciting feeling? Yes. He is a sword idiot, and he has spent countless battles since he was a child. He can't remember how many swordmasters he has challenged. He only knows that when he became the #1 in the world, this world will never again, no one can make him feel excited with swordsmanship. A few years ago, his friend Shanks was able to compete with him to relieve his loneliness, but when Shanks lost an arm in East Blue for no reason, he never competed with Shanks again. He finds that boring. But now, there is another sword hero who can relieve his loneliness. Let his heart, his blood, and his whole body become excited. He stared at Sorata on the Liberty's bow, and Sorata stared at him. Two pairs of eyes, one pair of yellow like the eyes of an eagle, and one pair of blue like a starry sky. Where the eyes meet, there is a sound of thunder out of thin air. Boom. Although outsiders can't hear it, they all know that the other party is an opponent who makes them go all out. Advertisement, Hawkeye. Kuina looked at the insignificant boat in the distance compared to the marine warship in the White Iron. Her face was full of solemnity, but her eyes were full of excitement. As long as he is a swordsman, no one wants to climb up. Ascend to the supreme position that belongs to the swordsman, the throne of the world's #1 swordsman. That is the ultimate dream in every swordsman's heart, and it is also the pursuit of every swordsman's life. She held the knife with Yi Dao Yuan in her left hand, and couldn't help but lift it up, and her right hand subconsciously wanted to touch the handle of the knife. But at this moment, a sound of thunder that only the swordsman could hear woke her up, causing her outstretched right hand to freeze. While her eyes flickered, she slowly put down her hands, her body relaxed, and she turned to look at Sorata beside her. Her eyes were tender. What about being #1 in the world? Her man is the strongest in the world. She knew that the world's #1 swordsman on the opposite side was not something she could match now. Therefore, I can only watch Sorata's. Sensing Kuina's gaze, Sorata withdrew her gaze and turned to face Kuina with excitement on her face. He didn't expect to meet Mahawk here. He had just passed the practice and sent him the best candidate to prove his own strength. He didn't even know if there was a halo of luck that made him so lucky. What he didn't know was that he didn't meet Mahawk, but Mahawk was waiting for him, and Mahawk was here waiting for him for 4 months. In the past 4 months, he has been able to choke the pirates passing through this sea area. In general, it is the luck of the two of them. One is to relieve the loneliness of being invincible for too long, and the other is to verify one's own strength. Isn't this a thunder and fire? Just a pair? As for Marine, the Liberty ignored it and went straight ahead. On the warship, the young Rear Admiral looked at the Liberty getting closer and the two young figures on the bow of the Liberty, and clenched his fists. Then he raised his hand with firm eyes, waved it down, and shouted loudly, "Fire!" Boom, without any hesitation, all the cannons were ignited at the same time, and smoke and dust were everywhere. Amidst a huge roar, countless shells shot into the sky, and then drew an arc in the air, like raindrops, and swooped towards Liberty. Mahawk withdrew his eyes that were covered by the shells, and looked up at the young Rear Admiral standing beside the warship, his eyes fixed. "Marine, it's not your way to seek death. You should know who the other side is." "No." Rear Admiral glanced down at Mahawk. The firmness in his eyes did not change at all. "Marine is fighting pirates, what can I say?" "Advertisement." "No." Mahawk looked back. "Courage is commendable, but too young and too stupid. Do you really think the other party has no temper?" Over and over again. As far as he knew, there were more than one Marines that the silver-haired gang let go of. Sure enough, a silver-gray slash cut through the countless shells covering the Freedom, and then quickly slashed towards the military aircraft under the horrified eyes of the young Rear Admiral and his deputy behind him. Before the slash was approaching, the sense of oppression brought by the slash gave them a thought that they were dead. They stood in place, their pupils constricted, watching the oncoming attacks, and they didn't even have time to make any moves. Puff, in an instant, the silver-gray slashed, rubbed their scalps, cut off the hats on their heads, and the hair on the top of their heads, and continued to move backwards, cutting off the masts behind them in the cabins on the deck, and then disappeared into the snow behind them in the field. In the end, Sorata relented. It didn't really slash at people. For these Marines who were still fearless when facing him, who can be called the world's top pirate. But Marine couldn't stand it and fired at him again and again, provoking him. Anyway, you have to have the face of the strong, because only by truly protecting yourself can you protect more people in the future. This is not bravery, nor heroism, but stupidity. He is not annoying. To say it's annoying, it's actually a little bit, although this bit of shelling is useless to them. With the experience of the old Marine, he would not easily provoke pirates like Sorata. Just like this young Rear Admiral, he clearly knew that Sorata was a completely invincible opponent for him, and he also knew that Sorata should not hurt them, but he still impulsively ordered his subordinates to fire to provoke Sorata. So troubles are troubles, people, he still doesn't intend to kill. On the contrary, when facing an opponent that you can't beat at all, you have to bite the bullet and go up to die, especially if the opponent has no killing intent and you have to go up. But when he saw that the opposite boat was full of young Marines, he stopped. Isn't this stupid? What is it? It also allows them to really feel the taste of death, so that they will not be so reckless in the future. Facing an opponent who is completely invincible, temporarily retreating is not a shame, but a kind of growth. If it weren't for this Rear Admiral and this Marine team, who were too young, they might have died long ago. He is a strong man. Let this slash be a lesson to these young Marines. Chapter 68 Rumors. Mahawk looked back, looked at the crack formed by the rear slash, and nodded. Then he turned his head and looked at the head of the young Rear Admiral, with a strange flash in his eyes. That silver-haired guy, he can't really be from Marine. In the past few months, I don't know where the news spread, saying that the silver-haired group is from Marine. An example was also given, and it was on the news, and the evidence was spread across the sea. Since the silver-haired gang went to sea, they have not left a single life for the pirates. The opposite is Marine. The silver-haired group also encountered a lot of Marines, and they didn't kill a single Marine. This is rather strange. So in the past few months, the news that the silver-haired group is from Marine has been spread rapidly by the newspaper. When the news first came out, most people thought the news was a joke, but the silver-haired gang never came out to refute the rumors, and this view gradually gained more people's recognition. So Mahawk saw that Sorata didn't kill these Marines, so it was so strange. At this moment, beside the warship, a white figure appeared silently. He reached out and patted the young Rear Admiral on the shoulder, and said with a light smile, "Well, first said, Marine, why do you guys have such a short memory? Your boss should tell you not to provoke me. Why are you shooting at me?" Rear Admiral's stiff body warmed up. The moment the slash came, he really thought he would die. The spirit that was swallowed by the boundless darkness came back when Sorata's hand patted his shoulder. He turned his head mechanically and looked at Sorata, his slack eyes gradually condensed. When he saw Sorata's appearance clearly, his pupils shrank subconsciously, showing a look of fear, and then the fear disappeared, and instead quickly filled with determination and anger. Firm and easy to understand, but, what is he angry about? Do not know. Since he didn't know, Sorata asked, "Marine, what are you angry about?" Rear Admiral wanted to raise his hand to knock off Sorata's hand, but he found that, except for his head, everything around him seemed to be still. Of course, it also includes his body. He turned his head to stare at Sorata, and shouted angrily, "Pirate, what did you do to me? Don't think you are a big pirate with a reward of 1.5 billion. I'm afraid of you. I tell you, I can't. I'm afraid of you, a mere pirate." Oh, Sorata nodded, staring at Kido. The smile in his eyes disappeared. The spirit is commendable, but why are you so stupid? Advertisement. You, facing an enemy that you are completely invincible, but blindly irritating the other party, and even rushing forward to seek death. What is it if you are not stupid? He looked at Kido, withdrew his hand, pulled off the wine gourd on his waist, and took a sip with his head up. In this world, you don't have to be fearless to achieve justice. There is nothing wrong with fighting pirates, but you must do what you can. Huh, he lowered his head, let out a sigh of alcohol, and smiled lightly at Kido. Protecting civilians from being attacked by pirates, of course you can be fearless, but facing me, I don't intend to hurt civilians, hurt you Marines people. Don't you think it's a very stupid behavior to provoke me? If I am in a bad mood today and really kill you, have you ever thought about the family behind you, the family behind the hundreds of subordinates under you? He paused, raised the wine gourd and took another sip, then patted Kido on the shoulder, and said, so, young man, don't be so impulsive in doing things in the future, and think about the consequences. You won't be able to meet me every time. Such a person. You, Kido stared at Sorata, speechless for a while. What's the matter with the tone of this senior teaching the younger generation? Also, have you forgotten who you are? You are a pirate. Why don't you say so much to me, Marine? He looked at Sorata and kept complaining in his heart. Then he seemed to think of something, and his eyes towards Sorata gradually became strange. In the past few months when the silver hair disappeared, there was only one piece of news about the silver hair. Of course he knew about it. This guy can't really be from our Marine. Otherwise, how can I explain that this guy treats him like a senior treats a junior, and still talks so much to him? What's wrong? Sorata felt Kido's gaze, and asked strangely, am I wrong? Kido looked at Sorata and didn't speak, but his eyes became more and more strange. Before he was promoted to Rear Admiral some time ago, he went to East Blue to carry out a mission, passed by the town of Rog, and had a few conversations with a senior named Smoker there. At that time, Senior Smoker seemed to have told him that the silver-haired group should be from Marine, but he didn't think so, and turned around and forgot about it. But seeing Sorata now, reminded him of the words of Senior Smoker. It seems that many people in Marine think this guy is one of their own. Thinking of this, he couldn't help but feel a little regret for his behavior just now. Hey, why are you getting weirder and weirder? Sorata looked at Kido and couldn't help but take a few steps back. This guy can't be a masochist. He even laughed. Okay. Advertisement. Thinking of this, he couldn't help but shudder. How come the sea is full of weird people? Kido looked at Sorata and didn't speak, just kept smiling. Mahawk under the warship couldn't stand it any longer. He looked up at Sorata with the same strange eyes. He said what he thought of, and he wouldn't hide it like Kido. Hey, silver hair, you can't be from Marine. What? Sorata turned to look at Mahawk with a look of shock on her face. From Marine? You be asterisk 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 D. You have to have a degree in talking nonsense. When did first become a Marine? Mahawk looked at Sorata with disbelief. Mahawk stared at Sorata for a while, looked away, and nodded. Mahawk looked at Sorata, shrugged helplessly, and chuckled. In fact, as long as you have a little brain, it is impossible to regard Sorata as a Marine. Seeing that Mahawk's expression became more and more weird, Sorata quickly explained that he didn't want people to misunderstand him as someone from Marine. Sorata stared and blinked. See, look at what? With such a strong combat power, if you don't keep it to guard the Marine, but let it out as a pirate, isn't it a brain bag? Okay, trust you. Hey, have you seen my pure 24K titanium eyes? Then he looked up at Sorata and joked, really? Mahawk's eyes showed doubts? Really not. Lousy's majestic reward of 1.5 billion big pirates, how could it be from Marine? If I really belong to Marine, staying in Marine will be much more comfortable than being a pirate. 2. Really? Really, it's truer than the tip of a needle. Come and see. He felt a kind of sympathy between Swordsman and Sorata, which is why he and Sorata have this conversation, which is slightly inconsistent with their identities. Sometimes the friendship between people is so strange, and he doesn't know why, but after meeting Sorata, he is not as eager as before. Chapter 69. You are not the face of a king. Seeing the smile on Mahawk's face, Sorata raised the corners of her mouth, followed by a smile, then retracted her head, and raised the wine gourd. Goo goo, ha 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 ha. One more friend, worth a few more sips. Sorata puts her hands down and laughs happily. Kido glanced back and forth between Sorata and Mahawk, and a string of question marks floated above his head. What are you doing? You two are playing charades here. He shook his head, looking at Mahawk, his eyes lit up. He finally knew why Mahawk was here. He was waiting for the silver-haired guy. I have long heard that Hawkeye Mahawk is a sword idiot. In the early years, he searched everywhere for swordmasters to compete with each other. After becoming the #1 in the world, he restrained himself. But he also wanders in the Grand Line from time to time, looking for those seed players who he thinks are qualified to challenge him, and sending them the warmth of being #1 in the world. Unexpectedly, this guy waited for 4 months in one place this time, just to wait for silver hair. I have to say that the rumors are really true. Okay, no kidding. Sorata glanced at the Liberty that was coming and parked next to the military aviation, looked back at Kido and asked. Marine, can you tell me what you are doing here? I'm looking for a man named Wapple. Do you know him? He didn't know the Iron King, so he didn't know that Wapple was on the next ship. In order not to see Mahawk, this fellow Wapple hid in the cabin with him, except for a few sailors, and never appeared again. Wapple? Kido looked at Sorata, thought for a while, then raised his head to stare at Sorata. What are you looking for, Wapple? The king of the Magnetic Drum Kingdom. What to do? You don't need to know. Sorata waved his hand. Just tell me if you know where he is. He raised the wine gourd, took a sip, thought for a moment, and then said to Kido. Just pretend that I let you go. What? I have an opinion. Kido has no objection, but Wapol is the mission target of his trip. If he tells Sorata that Sorata hurt Wapol, what about his mission? Forget it, you don't need to say it. Sorata has discovered the traces of Wapol at this time, and he saw a familiar figure on the deck of the Iron King, Afro Boxer, one of Wapol's 2 men. Chromaruman came out by himself. He saw that he hadn't moved outside for so long and heard the shelling of the marine warship, so he ran out to check. Sorata looked down at Mihawk and said, "Hey, you go to the shore and wait for me. I have something to do, and it will be over soon." Advertisement. Mihawk glanced at Sorata, looked away, lowered his head, and drove the boat to the shore gradually. He jumped onto the pier and put his feet on the snow. He didn't care what happened to Sorata. Just wait, I've been waiting for 4 months, and I don't care about it for a while. He is less eager now. "Hey, silver hair, what the hell are you looking for with Wapol? What's the matter? Don't worry about it, you just have to watch it." Sorata turned her head and looked at Chromaruman on the White Iron King ship opposite. The figure disappeared instantly, leaving a warning message to Kido and Marine in the air. "Also, don't attack me again. I have a temper. If I attack again, I won't show mercy to you and your subordinates again." "Master Rear Admiral." The deputy walked to Kido's side and looked up at him. Kido waved his hand and turned to stare at the White Iron King. "Okay, inform all the staff and stand by, to understanding." The deputy gave a military salute, turned around and went to make arrangements. Kido withdrew his gaze, turned his head to look at the White Iron King. His thoughts were tumbling. He listened to Sorata's words. Regarding the result of this impulse, he needs to reflect on it carefully. Sorata was right. If he didn't learn his lesson, he wouldn't meet someone like Sorata every time. If he doesn't learn his lesson, maybe the next time will be the end of his voyage and life. On the deck of the Iron King, Sorata's figure silently appeared beside Chromaruman. His eyes were indifferent, and when he appeared, Chromaruman froze in place. How could he not know the silver-haired man who was famous all over the world some time ago? It is because of knowing that he looks like this. He turned his head to look at Sorata in horror and stammered, This, my lord, may I ask, what can I do for you?" Sorata didn't answer his words. Red eyes flashed, and observation hockey swept across the Iron King in an instant. To say that there are those people on this ship who don't need to die. That must have been the 20 doctors, all forced, but not at all wrong. After the death of the crabby doctor, Hirulik, Dr. 20 was moved by his behavior and secretly researched medicine behind Wapol's back. Sorata withdrew her knowledgeable look, stared at the afro in front of her, and couldn't help but think of Dalton. Dalton, like this guy, was Wapol's guard, but Dalton chose a completely different life from them. Thinking of Dalton, he couldn't help flashing a thoughtful look in his eyes. Advertisement. That guy should still be locked in the dungeon in the palace on Magnetic Drum Mountain. After he has dealt with the Wapol gang, these doctors and the residents of the island should automatically rescue him. After all, after Wapol's death, Dalton is the only one on Magnetic Drum Island who is qualified to continue the kingdom of Magnetic Drum. He shook his head and stopped thinking about it. The knife flashed, and the explosive head froze in place. It's too fast. Is this the strength of the big pirate who was offered a reward of 1.5 billion? Puff, the light in Chromaruman's eyes quickly dissipated, his body fell backwards, and he lay on his back on the deck with a bang. His body and head were separated, and blood spattered everywhere. UB***********. At this moment, a loud roar came from the cabin. Wapol looked down at Cromley's head that had rolled to his feet. His eyes were bloodshot and red with anger. He strode out of the cabin and stared at Sorata. "Little devil, do you know who you killed? Do you know who I am?" Apparently he didn't know Sorata. That's right, with this guy's arrogant personality, it's usually the younger brothers who pay attention to the news, so he doesn't pay attention to the little things on the news. The archer Jess, who was following Wapol, saw Sorata's appearance clearly, and kept backing away in fright. His pupils contracted to ultimate, and his whole body trembled. "What's the matter, Lord Jess?" Jace didn't answer. His whole mind was taken away by Sorata. Only fear remained in his heart. "Who are you? I don't need to know." With a wave of his right hand, Sorata shook off the bloodline on the blade, then looked up at Wapol, raised Zon Kong, pointed the tip of the knife at him, and said indifferently, "But I know that the crown is worn on the head of people like you. I really can't stand it. You are not the face of a king." As he said that, he turned his right hand, quickly raised Zon Kong. The blade flashed, and under the horrified eyes of everyone around him, he slashed fiercely at Wapol's neck. "Move." When Sorata stared at him, Wapol knew that he had kicked the iron plate. From Sorata's beautiful and indifferent eyes, the infinite oppression revealed that his whole body was drenched with sweat in an instant. Feeling the sharp edge on his neck that made his hair stand on end, he roared in his heart and exerted all his strength. "However, I can't move at all. That's too late." The light of the knife crossed his neck in an instant. He could feel that even if he could move, he shouldn't be able to avoid this light-speed blade. He looked at Sorata, his eyes moved, trying to forcefully dispel the rapidly approaching darkness. However, his body and spirit did not give him this opportunity at all, and his mind was quickly swallowed by the dark abyss of death. Puff, heads flew up, blood spattered everywhere. Chapter 70. The candidate for the new king on the deck of the Iron King. It was as quiet as if time had stopped. Everyone looked at Sorata with fear in their eyes, not even daring to breathe. This guy. How dare to kill their king so easily. On the warship, Kido looked at Waipal's headless body and frowned. Trouble. He also didn't expect that his first mission as a rear admiral would fail in this way. Sorata stared at Waipal's body, which was still spurting blood, with disgust in his eyes. He stretched out his left hand and pushed forward through the air. Boom! Quickly bounced the corpse in front of him, and then the space field spread out in an instant. I saw that the deck below was suddenly torn apart amidst a harsh creaking sound, and the long strips of wood were waving quickly like noodles, and each noodle was like a rope, precisely entangled with a person's neck, and then gradually tightened. All the people in the spatial domain were struggling violently, trying to speak out, but there was no sound. Amidst bursts of puffs, everyone on the deck was separated from their heads. Of course, it also includes Archer Jess. He lowered his head, looked at the 20 doctors in doctor uniforms, and did not speak. Withdrawing his gaze, he waved his right hand to shake off the bloodline on the blade, then retracted the knife into its sheath, and the figure disappeared in the same place. Tick-tock. 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 Blood dripped down the shattered deck continuously, and the sound was extraordinarily loud in the quiet cabin, just like dripping into the hearts of many doctors in the cabin, making them feel as if they had just been caught by Sorata's eyes. The mind that was taken away quickly returned. The unemotional look that Kangtu looked at just now made them think that they were doomed. Now that he came back to his senses, looking at the purgatory-like scene around him, even though they were all doctors, they were used to seeing patients, and they were even more used to seeing death in the past few years, they couldn't help but twitched in their hearts. Boom! At this moment, a head rolled down from the broken deck. Attracted everyone's attention. After they saw the appearance of that head clearly, they didn't know whether to cry or laugh. Anyway, it's quite complicated. Although this guy is brutal and dictatorial, but, after all, he is the king of their magnetic drum kingdom and the object of their allegiance. This sudden death made them feel confused. Next, what should Drum Kingdom do? At this moment, Kido jumped on the Iron King. He was indifferent to the corpses around him, and when he saw Sorata leaving, he felt the breath of living people on the Iron King, so he jumped over to have a look. Take a look at his mission, whether it can save the rescue. Advertisement. Hello. You are Waipal's royal doctor, that is, the kingdom's royal doctor, and you should be the ones who know the Drum Kingdom best. Now that Wapol is dead, do you know who can inherit Waipal's throne on Drum Island at this time? This is his purpose. Since Wapol is dead, then find another king. Anyway, the world government doesn't care about who is the king of a small country. As long as this country pays the heavenly gold as scheduled every year. Not to mention changing the king, it is the name of the country, you can change it if you want. He only needs to bring the king of one of the joining countries to the Holy Land Marijoy to participate in the World Summit, that's it. Hearing the sound, the doctors looked up quickly, and they breathed a sigh of relief when they saw that it was Marine. They lowered their heads and thought for a while, and then everyone's eyes lit up. Then they looked up and turned their heads, looked at each other, and nodded. They thought of one person at the same time. One of the doctors raised his head, looked at Kido and said, "If you want to say who else in Magnetic Drum Island is capable of taking on the important role of king at this time, there is, and only one." "Who?" "That's the former captain of the Kingdom Guard, Dalton." "Dalton?" Kido thought for a while, and realized that he had never heard of this person before. He looked down and spoke directly. "And where is this Dalton?" "Lord Dalton was imprisoned by Wapol some years ago in the prison at King's Castle." "Oh." K-Duo nodded. It turned out to be a prisoner. "What?" K-Duo paused, stared at the doctor and asked in doubt, "Since he is a prisoner, how can he be a king?" The doctors looked at each other, then looked up at Kido, and said loudly with firm eyes, "Because only Dalton can lead the Drum Kingdom again, and only he can be qualified to be the king, because he is the only one on the island at this time. A king who can be loved and accepted by the people of the whole country." "Oh." K-Duo nodded and didn't ask any more questions. If he can be loved and accepted by the people of the whole country, he must be a good king. "Let's go quickly. Let's rescue your king as soon as possible, so I can complete the task sooner." Hearing this, the doctors quickly climbed up the stairs, ignoring the hellish scene around them, and followed Kido ashore. The new Magnetic Drum Kingdom led by Dalton will surely restore its former glory, and they firmly believe in this. Advertisement. Looking at the Magnetic Drum Mountain in the distance, their eyes were full of hope. Sorata didn't pay much attention to the actions of Marine and Dr. 20. As for the fact that Dalton was promoted by the doctors to be the king, he had predicted it from the beginning. So no surprise. It's just that he didn't expect that under Kido's urging, Dalton could become king so quickly. In order to complete the task, Kido rescued Dalton in less than an hour. And the guards of the palace, after hearing that their king Wapol was dead, instead of stopping Marine and the doctor, they acted as the leading party with excitement on their faces. It can also be seen from this that the positions of Wapol and Dalton in the hearts of the people are completely different. Sorata got ashore and walked straight to her companions. When passing by Mahawk, he stretched out his hand, put it on his shoulder, and let him pass with him. Mahawk is about the same height as him, so they walked together in harmony. "Mahawk, it's okay if I call you that." Sorata laughed loudly, withdrew his right hand, turned around and walked towards his partners. "Come on, let me introduce my partners to you. As for our sparring, let's talk about it later." "Do you think so, Gudu? If they fight here, an avalanche can be triggered at any time, and it is a big avalanche. It is a natural disaster that is completely irresistible to the creatures on this island and the residents on this island. Up to you. Besides, if the two of us want to fight with all our strength, it's impossible to be on this island." As he spoke, he let out a breath of alcohol, turned his head to look at Mahawk, retracted his right hand, stopped, turned around, and extended his right hand to Mahawk. The corner of Mahawk's mouth twitched, but he still reached out and shook Sorata's hand. Sorata, please give me your advice. It won't be too late to take Sorata and the others their lair to compete. Sorata tore off the wine gourd, took a sip, and continued, you're not yet 40. I don't want to call you uncle, so it's better to just call you by your name. He shrugged, his face full of indifference. Ha 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 ha. Well, then I'll call you that from now on. Mahawk. My name is Sorata, Sora from space. Tai from space. We are friends now, please advise me. Being hugged by Sorata on the shoulders, Mahawk felt uncomfortable for a moment, but followed Sorata and walked forward. Although he is a pirate, he is indeed a sword idiot, but he has not yet reached the point of disregarding the lives of countless civilians for the sake of fighting. And there is an uninhabited island not far from here. Mahawk glanced at the snow-covered mountains in the distance, and nodded. Chapter 71 Snow Country and Chopper. After introducing his companions to Mahawk, Sorata asked him to wait for him at the pier for a while, and then asked Tahua and the others to carry supplies on the Iron King, while he took Kuina to the distant village. You were here, of course you were going to meet the cute blue-nosed reindeer. The villagers in the village didn't know what happened on the pier, so after seeing the unfamiliar appearance of Sorata and the two, their eyes were full of vigilance, but during Sorata's polite questioning, one of the villagers still pointed them in the direction. Although he didn't know where Chopper was, he knew that Chopper must be studying medicine at Dr. Correa at this time. Dr. Correa is the teacher who taught Chopper's lifelong medical skills, and it can also be said to be Chopper's mother. She called Chopper, stupid son. She and the first quack doctor, Hirulik, who took in Chopper are close friends in heart. And she doesn't behave like a doctor, but like a pirate, so she is called a witch by the people on the island. Although Dr. Correa is called a witch and the medical charges are expensive, he is an out-and-out doctor with superb medical skills. He is also the only doctor in the Drum Kingdom that is not under the control of Wapple. So although everyone did not welcome her and didn't like being healed by him, they were still very grateful to her in their hearts. Kaleha is very famous, so when Sorata asked, the villagers knew that although the villagers didn't know the exact location, they knew that it was near the village. Sorata asked Kuina to go north after asking the direction. Is it Geistar, a small town on the north side of the lake? He remembered that Korea's home was in a treehouse with giant trees, and no one else lived around. So as long as you get to Geistar, it's easy to find. Not far from the town of Big Horn, they saw a huge grizzly bear walking upright with a cane walking slowly in front of it. The grizzly bear is a unique hiking bear on Magnetic Drum Island. It often walks with a walking stick and does not speak, as if it is traveling. Pedestrians would bow and salute if they walked by him. Of course, Sorata and the others were no exception. Sorata pulled Kuina to a stop, turned sideways, made way for the hiking bear, and bowed down to salute it. And this guy bowed down to them politely and nodded. Sorata raised her head, looked at the hiking bear passing by, and said with a chuckle, what a magical island. Okay. Kuina followed suit and nodded. Cold. Looking at the heavy snow gradually falling in the sky, Sorata turned to look at Kuina, and stretched out her hand to press the scarf around her neck. This level of cold, his physique is fine, but for Kuina, who has been afraid of the cold since childhood, it is a bit uncomfortable. Advertisement. Although she put on a padded jacket and overcoat when she went to the island, Kuina couldn't help shrinking her neck in the face of the bone-piercing wind and snow. Drum Island is much colder than Bath. The entire island here, including the surrounding sea area, is shrouded in thick clouds, and it basically snows all year round. So looking at it from a distance, the whole island is shrouded in snowdrifts. The magnetic drum mountain in the center of the island is half buried in the snow, although it is as high as 5,000 meters above sea level. Not only the snow is heavy on the island, but the wind is also strong, which forms the magnetic drum mountain, which is like a cylindrical shape. The vertical mountain wall of Sigu Mountain was formed by wind erosion. Fine. Kuina looked at Sorata and smiled softly. Although the weather is cold, as long as Sorata is around, she doesn't feel cold at all. Let's go. As she spoke, she stretched out her hand to hold Sorata's arm, pulling him forward and looking at the snowflakes falling from the sky. Her face was full of smiles. She hadn't been so alone with Sorata in a long time, so peacefully. Looking at Kuina's red cheeks, Sorata's eyes flashed with infinite tenderness. In this life, it is his luck to have such a lover who follows him, believes in him, and supports him in everything he does. He looked up at the snow that was falling more and more heavily, and the space domain expanded, blocking both the snow and the wind outside. Feeling Sorata's thoughtfulness, Kuina smiled even more in her eyes. She said nothing, resting her head on Sorata's shoulder, enjoying the peace and happiness that belonged only to them at this moment. Geistar Village, in a deep forest outside. Sorata pulled Kuina and stood outside Dr. Kaleha's treehouse, looking up at the huge tree crown with rushing green leaves above the treehouse, with curiosity in his eyes. The underside of the giant tree was hollowed out and made into a room. Unexpectedly, this tree was still alive and strong. It's amazing. Sorata withdrew his gaze, let go of Kuina's hand, looked at the wooden door in front of him, felt two oars, one big and one small, and a smile flashed in his eyes. Boom. Advertisement boom. Boom boom boom. The sound of knocking on the wooden door was particularly ear-piercing in this silent forest. So when Sorata rang for the first time, the short breath inside stopped the movement of its hands, and quickly turned into a reindeer. At this time, Chopper was still very afraid of strangers and humans, so he only used the human beast form in front of Kureha, and he always used the animal form when he went to the doctor. Chopper, whose full name is Tony Chopper, was named after the first person who adopted him, Hirulik. It means that he has a pair of horns that can easily cut down even trees. Chopper is a reindeer that ate human fruit, a common fruit that has no form. He can use the blue wave ball he invented to perform 8-stage transformation. This guy can be said to be a human being with a high IQ, except that he does not look like a human being. Why is it said that Chopper has a high IQ? Do you think that anyone can develop a magic pill like Rambo Ball that allows you to have 8 changes? And he only spent, I don't know the exact time, anyway, in less than 10 years, I have learned the medical skills of Kureha's life, and I can do it myself. Such an IQ is not high, then there is no high IQ. I don't know why, but Chopper and Sengoku have high IQs, while Luffy. Forget it, Luffy's IQ may have been spent on fighting. After all, each has its own strengths, right? Ha ha. Who is it? It wasn't until Sorata rang for the third time that Kureha's voice came out of the house. Inside the house, it was strange to say that it was snowing heavily outside, but it wasn't cold inside, and I don't know why. Kureha. An old woman with long white wavy hair in a simple t-shirt with sakura flower petals printed on the front and a pair of purple jeans. She has a sharp chin, black sunglasses on her face, and a bottle of plum wine in her hand. She is lying on a deck chair beside her, drinking the wine. When she heard the knock on the door, she was taken aback for a moment, then quickly sat up, gently placed the wine bottle on the desk next to her, took 2 axes from the wall, and then looked at the door. Vigilantly open your mouth. Chapter 72. Since Shiruluk's death, no one has been here except Chopper. Although everyone on the island knew where she was, they didn't know where she was. And the villagers would not come here to find her, because that would attract Wapple. Wapple has been looking for her all the time. That's why she was full of vigilance against the sudden knock on the door. She was thinking, if Wapple's escort team really found this place, then she and Chopper could only abandon this place and move to other places. Okay. As if feeling the tension of the old and the young in the house, Sorata withdrew his right hand, stroked his chin in thought for a while, and then said, "We are travelers from other islands, and we are just curious about such a remote place when we come here. Why is there a tree house of this style, so I take the liberty to bother." From other islands? Kahale looked at the door, thought for a while, and walked over. Squeak. The old wooden door of the treehouse opened from the inside out. Because the wooden door was too old, it was not very flexible, and there was a piercing scream. The wooden door was opened wide, and the warm air in the room poured out, blowing away the cold surrounding the two of Sorata standing at the door. Sorata rubbed her hands, looked up at Kureha, and said softly, "Grandma, you are the owner of this place. Can we go in and rest for a while?" Kureha's nose and chin are very sharp. If she wears a hood, she looks like a witch. No wonder everyone calls her a witch. Kureha stretched out her hand, lifted up the sunglasses in front of her eyes and hung them on her forehead. What? When she lowered her head to see clearly the appearance of Sorata and Kuina, her complexion suddenly changed slightly, and her body froze slightly. Although Magnetic Drum Island is a winter island, there are not too many people, so there is no special open port for passing pirate ships and merchant ships. Therefore, the exchange of news can only rely on newsbirds. A few months ago, the news about Sorata was sent to the whole world by Morgans, including Drum Island of course, so Kuleha saw Sorata and Kuina in the newspaper. But thinking of such a big pirate who treats her so politely, he might not be a vicious pirate. And the newspaper also said that Sorata and his gang fought against the world government and marine in order to save Bath. Thinking of this, her complexion quickly returned to normal. He said calmly to Sorata, "I saw you in the newspaper, your name is Sorata, right?" "Okay." Sorata nodded. "You called me old lady just now, didn't you?" "Okay." Sorata continued to nod. Then he looked up and stared at Kahale in confusion. "What's wrong, mother-in-law?" Kureha frowned, raised the axe in his hand and threw it at Sorata. "Go to hell, brat, pay attention to what you say." Advertisement. Sorata was taken aback. Red light flashed in his eyes, and he swung his head from side to side, easily dodging the axe thrown by Kureha. Then he raised his head and stared at Kureha, who was suddenly furious for no reason, with question marks all over his head. "What's wrong?" Kureha took the wine bottle on the table beside her, raised her head and took a few sips. Then he looked at Sorata and said seriously, "I'm still a young and beautiful person in my 30s. Quack quack. A flock of crows flew over Sorata's head, and there were more question marks. He stared at Kureha, the corners of his mouth twitching. "That's why you're angry. If not." Kureha looked at Sorata, the corners of his mouth turned up, and a smile appeared on his face. Hey, I'm still very young, brat, okay." Sorata shrugged helplessly, looked up at Kureha and said, "You won, let me call you the beauty head office." He tidied up his appearance and looked at Kureha seriously. "Hi beauty, can we go in and rest for a while?" After speaking, he opened his mouth and grinned at Kureha, as sincere as he could be, as if Kureha was really a beauty. Ha 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 ha. Kuina looked at Sorata and Kureha, and couldn't help laughing out loud anymore. The crisp laughter, like a wind chime, seemed to play a melodious music in the depths of this lonely forest, making the mountains, rivers, giant trees, and snowflakes no longer lonely. Kurika stared at Sorata and laughed. What a funny kid. Putting down her laughter, Kureha turned her body sideways and let the door open. Come in. It's so cold standing outside. It's okay if she doesn't say it. What she said made Kuina's laughter stop immediately, and her body shivered uncontrollably. The heating in the room was incomparable with the coldness of the outside world. Even though the heating had the upper hand the moment the door was opened, the cold that followed was mixed with snowflakes, like flowing water pouring down, continuously pouring into the room. Sorata glanced at Kuina, quickly took her hand, quickly walked past Kureha, and entered the wooden door. Squeak. Seeing the two of Sorata enter the house, Kureha hurriedly closed the wooden door, blocking all the boundless wind and snow outside from the door. Sure enough, after entering the house, the cold disappeared immediately. Sorata let go of Kuina's hand, looked left and right, and finally settled on the large fireplace on the right wall, with a flash of curiosity in his eyes. Not only hollowed out the tree, but also lit a fire inside to keep warm. The trees on this island are also magical enough. Advertisement. Thinking of it, he reached out and touched the wall next to him. Not cold, it was very warm. This tree can still keep warm. This is a bit incredible. I just don't know if I can take the boat. Thinking of this, he turned his head, looked at Kureha who was sitting on the sofa, and asked curiously, "Hello, beauty." "All right." Kureha looked at Sorata amusedly, stretched out his hand to interrupt him, and said, "Don't keep calling me beautiful. I know I'm young and beautiful, but you don't have to keep calling me a brat." As he spoke, he lifted the wine bottle and took a few more sips. You can tell at a glance that he is an old alcoholic. She exhaled alcohol, stared at Sorata and Kuina and smiled. "Little devil, do you want to know the secret of my eternal youth?" He. In no mood. Kuina looked at Kureha and replied coldly, "I'm only 16 years old, it's too early to worry about my appearance." Sorata shrugged and nodded, agreeing with Kuina's words. Kureha's hand holding the bottle froze, then raised her head nonchalantly. Sorata nodded helplessly. "We came here specially to see you and a blue-nosed reindeer." "Do you believe this, the villagers in the village told you?" After taking a few big gulps, a blush flashed across Kureha's face, and then quickly disappeared. Then she put the wine bottle in her hand heavily on the tea table in front of her, and looked up at Sorata and the two of them. Okay. That lame reason. As soon as Sorata opened her mouth, she knew it was false. Sorata hesitated slightly. Although she didn't feel any malice towards the two of Sorata, she knew that it was impossible for Sorata to come here unintentionally. "Boom, let's end the joke here. I know you are pirates, you are big pirates, I think there must be something for you to come here." Blue-nosed reindeer. Surprised, Kureha looked up at Sorata. Goo. He looked up at Kureha and said with a light smile, "If I say, I was in a dream, dreaming that there was a blue-nosed reindeer here, I don't know." She is almost 114, who hasn't seen her before. Chapter 73. I believe that one day, you will meet a partner who really needs you and accepts you. Kureha looked at Sorata for a while, then retracted her gaze, leaned on the sofa, and said, waving her hands. "Never mind. If you don't want to say it, don't say it." "Really, you actually used such a lame statement to fool me." After finishing speaking, she looked up at Sorata. "There's indeed a blue-nosed reindeer here, but he is not an ordinary reindeer, but my son, named Tony Chopper, who ate the human fruit reindeer." Oh. Kuina's eyes lit up. She turned her head curiously and searched the room. "The reindeer that ate devil fruit equals, oh. It must be cute. Don't look for it, he must be hiding in the room inside." "Hide?" Kuina turned her head, looked at Kureha, and asked, "Why are you hiding? Are you afraid of strangers?" Kureha picked up the bottle and drank again. She swallowed the wine in her mouth, breathed out the alcohol, nodded to Kuina, and shook her head again. Then he said, "Because Chopper's nose is blue, he was abandoned by his parents since he was born, and he was deeply excluded by the ethnic group." She paused, then continued. "Then one day, after he accidentally ate devil fruit, the other deer completely treated him like a monster, and the reindeer were very determined to drive him out of the herd. Even so, he still wanted to have companions. So he then came to the human village as a human being through the change of devil fruit. Is it because humans can't accept Chopper, which makes him afraid of seeing strangers?" "Okay." Kureha nodded, raised her head and drank the wine in the bottle, then threw the bottle aside casually, and continued talking to Kuina. "Although Chopper can possess human IQ and walk upright through devil fruit, his appearance is still completely different from that of humans, so it cannot be accepted by humans. Humans are not herds of deer. Humans, of course, kill monsters directly. If it weren't for the appearance of a quack doctor, this poor guy, Chopper, should have died. Even if he didn't die, he would have fallen completely and turned into a real monster. That quack doctor can't be you." Kuina looked at Kureha and asked. "No, it's a very stupid and naive person named Hirulik." "Stupid? Naive? Okay." Kureha nodded her head, a flash of memory flashed in her eyes, and continued. "Although that guy's medical skills are not very good, his heart is quite gentle. As a quack doctor, he tried to save the country through medical skills. Isn't it naive or stupid? What is it?" After saying that, Kureha shook her head, raised her head and drank the wine in the bottle in one gulp. Kuina looked at Kureha, The corners of her mouth turned up, and a smile appeared on her face. She could tell from Kureha's expression that Kureha should admire that doctor named Hirulik very much. What about Chopper? What's the hurry? Kureha put the empty bottle in his hand on the table, then took out another bottle of wine from the side, opened the bottle cap, and took a sip with his head raised. She exhaled alcohol and said to Kuina, advertisement. Although Chopper's heart was seriously injured, and he was extremely afraid of strangers, but because of the treatment of Hirulik, and his heart is very kind, he doesn't hate humans. Having said that, memories flashed in her eyes again. Since Shiruluk's death, he vowed to be a panacea for any disease. A panacea? A cure? Kuina thought for a while, then raised her head and asked, so Chopper is still a doctor? Okay. Kureha nodded and said, since you have found this place, you should know who I am. Do not know, Kuina answered simply and clearly. Do not know? Kureha looked at Kuina, then turned to look at Sorata. You really don't know? Sorata shrugged. Although he knew, he had to pretend not to know at this moment. Although the other party can easily see through that he is acting. Okay. Kureha withdrew his gaze, sat up straight, raised his head and said to Kuina, don't look at me like this. I am actually a doctor named Dr. Kureha. You can call me Dr. Doriel. After Hiruluk died, I was the one who took in Chopper and taught him all my medical skills. It's been so long. Kuina looked at Kureha and asked curiously, can you ask Chopper to come out and get to know him? Well, isn't he always there? Kuina followed Kureha's gaze to the door of another room. I saw that the door of the room had been opened a crack at some point. One was wearing shorts and a pink hat with a cross pattern on his head. He stood upright like a civet cat rather than a reindeer, and was resting his hands on the door frame. On the bed, the whole body was exposed outside, with half of the head sticking out, looking at Kuina and Sorata through the crack of the door. This is the goal of Sorata's trip, Chopper. Besides being cute, there's nothing special about it. Is this Chopper? So cute? Is this a pirate? It's no different? A paragraph of words flashed through the hearts of Kuina, Sorata, and Chopper at the same time. Hey, don't hide, your body is completely exposed. Sorata looked at Chopper and shouted. Chopper looked down, moved his body slowly, hid his body in the door frame, stuck out half of his head, and silently observed the outside. Hey, haven't you been exposed long ago? Why are you still hiding? Chopper stared at Sorata and shouted, stop talking, human. Ha 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 ha. When she really saw Chopper, Sorata was really cute by this guy. He looked at Chopper who was hiding in the door frame, with half of his head exposed, watching them silently, and couldn't help thinking of teasing him. Just as soon as he thought of it, his figure disappeared in an instant. Advertisement. Well, where did it go? Chopper looked out, surprised. Hey, are you looking for me? Behind Chopper, Sorata squatted down, stretched out her finger, and tapped the guy's back. The hair is so soft, and it's warm. No wonder everyone wants Chopper clothes. Well, when? Chopper trembled in fright, then quickly opened the door, and rushed out yelling. Ha 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 ha. Sorata looked at Chopper and laughed loudly, you can't escape. Then his body disappeared directly in place, appeared in front of Chopper, stretched out his hands, grabbed Chopper's hands, and lifted him up. Hateful. Chopper looked at Sorata and suddenly swelled into a strong human form. He broke away from Sorata's hand and shouted, don't touch me, human. Oh, Sorata stared at Chopper and said with a smile. Here you are the leftover from the old era, and the new era doesn't have Joe's beard who can't take care of you. Ha ha ha. What are you talking about? You be asterisk 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 D. Chopper raised his right fist, turned sideways, roared, and punched Sorata in the head with a backhand. Appeared, and said that you are not Joe Beard, ha ha ha. Boom, Sorata stretched out his right hand, easily received Chopper's fist, and tore off the wine gourd with his left hand, and took a big gulp. Huh, cool. Okay, I won't play with you anymore. Sorata let go of Chopper's hand, glanced at Kureha, then turned to stare at Chopper. Chopper. What? Chopper replied, his body instantly shrunk, and he returned to his human beast form. He didn't feel any malice towards Sorata. I came here this time just to see you and to say something to you. Chopper looked up, question marks floating in his mind. What I want to say is that although Xilaluke died, he died with a smile. He was willing to die for the sake of this country. Although he failed to really save the country in the end, it woke up some people who really wanted to save this country, so, Chopper. What? There's no need to close your heart just because of the death of Shiruluk. I believe that one day, you will meet a partner who really needs you and accepts you. Partner? Chopper looked at Sorata with blank eyes. He didn't know why this human being said these words to him, but he could feel that Sorata didn't have any prejudice against him, and on the contrary liked him very much. Chapter 74. The two of Sorata didn't stay with Dr. Doriel much. After seeing Chopper, they said their goodbyes and headed back to the pier. During this period, Sorata also asked Madame Doriel to buy a few bottles of her plum wine. He originally wanted Dr. Doriel to give it to him, but this guy was unwilling, only willing to sell it to him. The reason given by Dr. Doriel was that he was a big pirate, and he was definitely not short of money. How could he have the nerve to ask her for wine from a doctor in a remote area? The reason was very good and powerful, and Sorata couldn't refute it, so he had to obediently pay and buy wine. But after he drank it, he realized that he had been fooled. The plum wine was not tasty, not to mention the alcohol smell. The alcohol content was pitifully low, and there was a sour smell of plums. Anyway, he didn't like it that much. On the contrary, Kuina liked the taste of plum wine very much, and bought a few more bottles from Madame Doriel. That's right, although plum wine doesn't have any alcohol taste, it's still very good as a drink. Moreover, Dr. Doriel added medicine to the wine, which is good for girls, so it's no wonder Kuina liked it. Sorata also asked about the tree she built her house on. At first, he wondered if this kind of tree was so tough that it could be used to make a boat. After asking, I found out that this kind of cold-resistant trees unique to Winter Island cannot be used for boats. Because the wood of this tree is easy to swell once it leaves the low-temperature environment, not to mention being used to make boats, even as materials for houses, it can only be used on Winter Island. As for Chopper, before Sorata saw him, she really wanted to lure this guy into the boat, but after seeing him, she immediately dismissed the idea. Because Chopper's medical skills have not yet graduated. Don't say whether he is willing or not, anyway, Dr. Doriel is definitely not willing. Don't talk about him at this time, even if Wang Luffy comes, don't let Chopper go to sea with him. Pier. The three of Ahua and Indigo moved all the supplies on the Iron King. Not to mention, the King of Wapple really enjoyed himself, with plenty of food and wine on board. The warehouses of the Liberty were filled with the things moved from the Iron King, and some of the warehouses couldn't fit, so they could only be placed on the front cabin and the deck. Since Wapple is always accompanied by 20 doctors, there are still a lot of medicines and surgical tools on the Iron King. These things were all moved back to the Liberty by Indigo, which greatly enriched his infirmary. Bo. Mihawk opened his coat, leaned on the recliner, and read the newspaper. On the coffee table next to the recliner, there is a cup of coffee, and the coffee is constantly steaming, and the steam is formed into shredded tobacco, which slowly rises into the air. From this point of view, it was just brewed, and everyone on their boat drank tea, so there was no such drink as coffee. Therefore, this cup of coffee can only be made by Mihawk himself. I don't know how his coffin-like boat put down these daily necessities. Presumably someone will be curious, how this guy is so convenient on the sea. Advertisement of course, Sorata was also curious. So, are you back? Mihawk put down the newspaper, took a sip of coffee, and looked up to the back of the pier. I saw two figures approaching Liberty without any haste. Sorata took Kuina by the hand, stood on the pier, glanced at Marine who was watching his marine warship vigilantly, and looked away. Lift your feet, follow the plank, and walk onto the Liberty. As soon as Sorata stepped onto the deck of the Liberty, a plump figure wearing a chef's hat rushed out of the kitchen. Awa is holding a kitchen knife in his hand, apparently cooking. He rushed in front of Sorata and complained loudly to him. Sorata, that guy named Hawkeye actually dislikes the tea I make. Hey, I'm still here. Mihawk was holding a coffee cup, standing on the deck on the roof of the front cabin, leaning against the railing, looking at Awa below and said, I don't hate it, I just can't get used to it. Are you not used to drinking? It's obviously disgusting, I can see your expression. Awa looked up at Mihawk and yelled angrily, oh. Sorata looked at Awa, with the corners of her mouth raised, showing a smile. He disliked your tea. Why did you tell me? Do you want me to teach him a lesson? Yes. Awa nodded without hesitation, and then looked at him expectantly. Why don't you do it yourself? Didn't you practice well in Little Garden? Ahua was speechless. Didn't I give you a chance? I'm not afraid of this guy. If he wasn't your friend, a guy who despises my tea-making skills, I would have taught him a lesson. When did you become so brave? Sorata looked at Awa with a strange flash in her eyes. Boom boom boom. At this moment, Arlo clapped his hands and walked up from the cabin below. As soon as he came up, he turned to Awa and said loudly, this guy can't even beat me normally, how could he dare to trouble Mihawk? You. Veins popped out of Ahua's forehead, he held the hatchet, turned around slowly, and stared at Aluo, do you want to fight again? Come. Aluo stretched out his hand, wiped his head, and stared at Awa sideways, with contempt in his eyes. Who is afraid of whom? If you haven't come yet, is it because you are afraid? You really don't know what to do, you don't know who is in Little Garden, and I beat you to the point of crying. Advertisement. You still have the nerve to talk about me, isn't it you who is crying for your father and mother? Aluo put down his hand, and Awa inserted the hatchet into his belt, his eyes staring at each other. In the next moment, the two rushed towards each other quickly. What, on the way of running, one raised his left hand and the other raised his right hand, and at the same time they smashed towards the opponent's head. Seeing that the fists of the two were about to hammer each other's faces. At this moment, a shadow enveloped the two of them. Boom. Boom. Kuina withdrew her hands, glanced at the two Ahuas who were lying on the ground with two big bumps popping out of their heads, her eyes were calm. Don't be ashamed, okay? There are guests on board. As she spoke, she clapped her hands, turned her head to look at Mihawk, and said, sorry, I made you laugh, these two guys are usually very. She thought for a while, then shook her head helplessly, they're always like this, just treat them as a joke. In the aisle outside the rear wheelhouse, Adao took a deep breath with a cigarette in his mouth. He looked down at the two of Awa with a haughty look in his eyes. He reached out to take the cigarette from his mouth, held it between two fingers, and opened his mouth to face the following. Breathe out a smoke ring, still so weak, still so stupid. Lonely, turned around and went into the kitchen. I don't know if it is a side effect of devil fruit. Mahawk drank his coffee and looked at everything below with a smile in his eyes. Aluo hurriedly followed Awa, apparently to help. Although the two guys were funny and disliked each other, they were always like a pair of happy enemies, and they would never really get angry with each other. HMPH, why are you venting your anger on me if you can't beat Kuina? This pretender. Sorata glanced at Adao's back and the corner of her mouth twitched. To understanding, in this kind of team, there are no obvious superiors and subordinates. They are all friends, so they can laugh and fight freely, but when it comes to critical moments, everyone is a partner and friend who can be entrusted with life and death. Since Adao ate the devil fruit, she became more and more pretended and arrogant. Hey, Awa stood up and glanced at Aluo. He shook his head, looked at Awa, and said with a smile. I'm done joking, let's stop here. Awa is almost noon, let's hurry up and prepare meals. Interesting, he had only seen the way a team like this got along in Red Hair Pirates. Humph, he turned, shook his head, and went into the wheelhouse. Chapter 75. Dalton. After drinking and eating, under the watchful eyes of Marine, the Liberty slowly sailed out of the harbor and headed for an unknown place. Sorata still didn't ask the question that he wanted to know so much. Mahawk was embarrassed. He was afraid that if he asked, Mahawk would turn his face on the spot, so that question could only be rotten in his heart. Drum Island is the island where Sorata and the others have spent the shortest time since they went out to sea. From when they docked to when they left, it took no more than 2 hours in total. During this period of time, Sorata first killed Wobble and then went to meet Chopper, so it was a worthwhile trip. What's more, he also met the world's #1 swordsman, Hawkeye Mahawk here. The supplies were quickly replenished by Wapol's friendly courier. This guy is really a good guy. ... Finally gone. The Marines all heaved a sigh of relief. Although Sorata didn't hurt any of them, as long as Sorata was still around. To them, it was as if there was a ferocious beast standing beside them. The ubiquitous sense of crisis and the unparalleled sense of oppression on the beast made them feel insecure. What? At this moment, the Marines all turned their heads and looked in the direction of the distant shore. I saw a line of snow, from the direction of the Big Horn, constantly spreading towards this side. The snow line is like a boulder rolling down from the top of the mountain. It not only plows a long gully in the snow, but also makes a bang sound. When they got closer, they realized that the snow line was not formed by any boulders, but a ferocious beast. In front of the snow line where the snowflakes were flying, a majestic black bull was stepping on the thick snow and rushing towards the pier. And behind the black bull, a group of soldiers in the uniform of the guards were panting heavily and hurriedly followed. Behind them, Kido led a group of Marines and walked slowly towards the port. Kido raised his hand to cover his forehead, staring at the black cow whose back was no longer visible, the corners of his mouth raised. This new king is really a simple guy. Hey Niu is Dalton, the former captain of the Drum Kingdom Guards, and also the king of the Sakura Flower Kingdom, at this time. After Kido rescued Dalton, he explained to Dalton the situation on Drum Island at this time. Dalton was excited for a long time after learning the news of Wapol's death. Then, under the witness of Marine, 20 doctors, and former soldiers of the Kingdom Guard, he quickly became the king. Advertisement just like what the doctors and the guards said, only he can continue to lead the new kingdom on Magnetic Drum Island at this time. And there is not so much time for him to hesitate, because if the kingdom on Magnetic Drum Island does not have a king to attend this world summit, their new kingdom may be removed from the alliance by the world government. At that time, without the protection of Marine, who will defend the tranquility of this sea area? With him, and the escort formed by these ordinary people? Impossible. Without Marine's protection, this place can only be completely reduced to a pirate's paradise. He is very clear about this point. The first thing he did when he became king was to change the name of Drum Kingdom to Sakura Flower Kingdom. He will never forget that a few years ago, a doctor named Hirulik J. Ming knew that Wapol had been looking for him. Knowing that this place may be a trap, especially when he knew that he would die when he came here. In order to save Dr. 20 and the country, he willingly stepped into the trap specially set by Wapol. When he knew that Dr. 20 was fine, he breathed a sigh of relief and then died generously. And said that paragraph, he will remember the words for a lifetime. When do you think people will die? When the heart was shot through? Wrong. When you have an incurable disease? Wrong. When you drank the poisonous mushroom soup? Wrong. It's time to be forgotten by the world. This passage, and the way Shirurik laughed with his head up at the end, and drank the bomb-containing wine, completely aroused his heart of resistance that had been buried in his heart for the sake of the country and the people. This is what happened next. He didn't know why he thought of the word Sakura when he chose the name of the country. Maybe it was the Sakura pattern next to the skull on the medical box of Brook, which impressed him too much. After knowing that it was not Marine who killed Wapol and saved the country, but the silver-haired gang, Dalton quickly took the guards and rushed towards the pier. He doesn't know who Silverhair is or why Silverhair killed Wapol, but he knows that if there is no Silverhair, then this country and its people will always be under Wapol's brutal rule and suffer forever. Advertisement, so he has to go and say, thank you, to the hero who saved the country. This is what he, the king, the new king who represents the will of many people, should mean. See. With a sliding shovel, Hei Niu plowed a long gully in the snow on the bank. Dalton raised his head, shook off the snow on his head, then stood upright and quickly recovered his body. Have they gone? He looked left and right, but he didn't see other ships, and his eyes showed a look of disappointment. Then he straightened his expression and looked at the White Iron King. Waipal's exclusive royal ship, as the former captain of the Magnetic Drum Kingdom Guard, of course he knows. He hesitated a little, but still stepped up and walked over. Although he had learned about Waipal's death from Dr. 20 and Marine before, but he had come here, how could he not go to see Waipal's body in person? The Marines on the warship did not stop Dalton, because they had already seen the figures of many of their Marine colleagues behind the escort in the distance. I think this is Kido Rear Admiral, the new king of Magnetic Drum Island. Unexpectedly, it was still a demon fruit power. They looked at Dalton curiously. Dalton ignored the curious eyes of the Marines. He walked to the side of the Iron King, looked up at the boundless and huge hippopotamus head on the bow, and there was a hint of sarcasm in his eyes. That Wobble guy treats everything in the kingdom as his own, eats whatever he wants. This guy is like a hippopotamus. He wants to take a bite of everything, sometimes hungry. Even the commoners resist the cold house. He could eat it all, not caring if it froze the inhabitants of this house to death. Boom boom boom. Withdrawing his gaze, Dalton stepped onto the wooden plank beside the boat, walking slowly. When I stood on the deck of the Iron King, I saw the headless corpse embedded on the back of the head of the hippopotamus. Through the broken deck, I saw the head of Wobble who rolled down into the cabin below. Dalton could no longer hold back the excitement in his heart, and burst into tears. So it's all true. It turns out that the B***** D King, Wobble, who has been hanging over Magnetic Drum Island and wantonly oppressing the people is really dead. He rushed to the port immediately. On the one hand, he wanted to meet the savior of Magnetic Drum Island. On the other hand, it is necessary to see Waipal's body with his own eyes. Only when he really sees Waipal's body can he be sure that all this is not a dream. Their Magnetic Drum Island was really saved, and they really ushered in a new life. Turn your head and face the sea. Thanks. The voice is full of gratitude, joy, and even more infinite expectations for the future. Chapter 76. The world's #1 with Mahawk leading the way. It didn't take much time for the Liberty to arrive at an uninhabited island. The island was discovered by Mahawk while wandering the waters for several months. In addition to going to Drum Island to inquire about news, he usually stays here most of the time. After all, with his coffin-like boat, it is impossible to stay in the sea forever. The island is not big, only about 10 kilometers away. There are no beaches on the island, let alone animals, except for trees and some resting seabirds. There is nothing. In the rocky pile in the middle of the island, Sorata and Mahawk stand opposite each other. Silently, but the momentum is gradually rising. The Liberty was parked next to a boulder beside the island, and the people on board were all standing on the boulder, staring excitedly at the center of the island. They could all feel the invisible aura collision between the two of them in the middle of the island. There was no sound. Suddenly, a sound like thunder flashed in the hearts of everyone. Are you going to start? Kuina tightly held the He Dao Yuan on her waist. Her eyes stared forward excitedly, and her body stood up straight, like a sharp sword about to be unsheathed, exuding a sharp breath all over her body. The last time Sorata and Golden Lion fought, they only watched the beginning, and they didn't enjoy it at all. This time is different. The collision of two top swordsmen in the world, one of which is still the #1 in the world at this time, makes me excited just thinking about it. In the middle of the island, Sorata stared at Mahawk, leaned forward, bent her legs, held the scabbard in her left hand, lifted it up, and touched the handle with her right hand. Can't wait any longer. The flowing armament haki instantly entangles Zonkong. This guy is too strong. He actually collided with his conqueror's haki just because of his swordsman's aura. As expected of a man standing on the throne of the swordsman apex. But there is one thing, he is very puzzled. Mahawk's aura is strong, but it can only target one person, so he can be sure that it is definitely not conqueror's haki. He didn't know that Mahawk was already sitting on the throne of the world's #1 swordsman. Why there is no conquerors? Does it really have to be genetic to have it? Then what happened to him? He is not a soul wearer, but a body wearer. He has conqueror's haki, but Mahawk, who stands at the top of the pyramid, does not have it, which is a bit strange. When he first awakened conqueror's haki, he really thought that it was just enough courage, but when he saw Mahawk, he understood. Conqueror's haki may not really be something that can be awakened just by being brave. Advertisement. No one doubts Mahawk's courage. If the #1 swordsman in the world doesn't have courage, then no one has courage. Forget it, don't want to. Sorata shook his head, let go of the random thoughts in his mind, and stopped thinking about it if he couldn't figure it out. The main task now is to fight this guy who put him under a lot of pressure. He raised his head, stared at Mahawk's calm eyes with a trace of excitement, and his eyes were fixed. Zonkong instantly unsheathed, one sword style EI/wave. How could the sword hero fight without flying slashes and clashes? It has always been said that this guy's slash is the best in the world, and he has to take a good look today to see how far it is from his slash. Puff, a huge crescent-shaped silver-gray slash cut through the air, and quickly moved towards Mahawk, slanting and slashing across. Before the slash came, Mahawk could already feel the infinite sharpness contained in Sorata's slash. He stared at Slash, his pupils constricted, his eyes narrowed. He raised his right hand, turned backwards, and grasped the hilt of Black Knife Knight. Jung. Yi came out of its sheath instantly, and the blade rubbed against the blade, making a pleasant chime. He holds Yi high in his right hand. The back of the knife is carried on his right shoulder, The handle of the knife is held in his left hand, and the knife is held in both hands. Facing the oncoming silver-gray slash, he slashed diagonally downward. Black light flashed. A huge light cyan slash moved forward quickly. Clang, the silver-gray slash and Mahawk's light cyan slash, in the shape of a cross, collided instantly. Rumble. White light flashed, and the ground instantly sank, and then with the slash and collision as the center, the ground seemed to become a sea wave, and quickly swept away with the shockwave. Facing the shockwave, Sorata jumped back, his eyes flashed red, and his upper body swayed from side to side, avoiding the stones caught in the shockwave. Then he did a backflip and stood on a boulder behind him, with silver hair all over his head, dancing wildly with the wind. Is this the collision of top swordsmen? It's too dazzling. On the boulder by the island, everyone stretched out their hands to cover their foreheads, squinted their eyes, faced the hurricane formed by the shockwave, and stared at the middle of the island with amazement in their eyes. Kaka. On the stone, Sorata stared at the center of the slash, with nebula in his eyes. Advertisement, it actually cut his slash so quickly. Kaka. In the center of the battle, on the silver-gray slash, cracks like spider webs continued to extend from the middle. Finally, with a click, it was completely broken. Then, under the power of the light cyan slash, the fragments rushed towards the surroundings, and finally stopped at Sorata, as if the power was exhausted, flashing silver-gray light, and quickly disappeared. As for Mahawk's light cyan slash, there was no change except that the color became lighter. It continued to move forward and quickly slashed towards Sorata. As expected of the best slash in the world, sure enough, there were only people who were called wrong, and there was no wrong title. If Mahawk's slash can be recognized by everyone as the world's #1, then it must be the world's #1. Sorata held the saber in his right hand and turned the saber body. With his arm vigorously, he looked at the oncoming slash and swung it upwards. Clang, feeling the power coming from Zonkong, Sorata exerted a little force with his right hand, and with a bang, the slash flew away. The light cyan slash, changed direction by Sorata's power, spiraled into the sky, and quickly flew towards the sky. It's okay to say that it's swordsmanship. If it's really a random slash, then this guy's swordsmanship must have reached the realm of perfection. Strong, too strong. There will be no such person. If he is really that powerful, then he is not #1 in the world, but a sword god. Boom. Shave Juhei, draw the sword and cut, do not. Is this the apex of a swordsman? This guy's slash is like flat A. I don't know if it's swordsmanship, or it's just a random slash. Zonkong is below, and Yi is above. Two knives with completely black blades collide with each other in an instant. Okay. Disappear the clouds above your head and disappear at the end of the sky. Mahawk's eyes flashed red. He held the knife in both hands, and slashed down quickly towards the open space in front of him. Wajing, the highest level of swordsmanship, every movement and stillness, is itself a swordsmanship, and there is no need to specially practice any other swordsmanship. Clang, when rushing forward, Zonkong instantly retracted his sheath. After all, this is just his own understanding of swordsmanship. Sorata glanced at the sky, looked away, and looked down at Mahawk with excitement in her eyes. Thinking of this, he kicked his feet on the ground, and with a whoosh, he rushed towards Mahawk quickly. Chapter 77. The Eye of the Eagle. Boom. In the open space in front of Mahawk, Sorata's figure appeared. His legs bent, and the stone under his feet shattered instantly, causing his body to sink downward. Feeling the power from Zonkong, veins popped out of Sorata's forehead, and his arms instantly grew bigger. He faced Yi, stood up straight, looked at the constantly trembling blade of Yi, and the distorted air around the blade, opened his mouth and let out a loud laugh. Ha 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 ha. It turns out that this guy's slash is not flat aw. His kind of slash was just his own slash made by this guy using Hei Daoyi. This kind of slash that could twist the air, he had seen on Zoro in his previous life. If you want to come to Zoro's slash, this guy taught you. It's just that compared to Zoro's slash, Mahawk's slash is more powerful and stronger. In fact, to know whether this guy has really arrived, the transformation environment he imagined is very simple. That is to force this guy to use sword skills. Sword skills can't be seen in long-range slashing, but in close combat, he can definitely sense it. Thinking of this, he raised his right hand vigorously. Clang, bounce away the knight, then quickly turn the body to the right, facing Mahawk on the left side, retract the right hand, raise the knife in front of the eyes, hold the handle of the knife with the left hand, and hold the knife with both hands. Then he turned his head to stare at Mahawk, turned his body to the left, stepped forward with his right foot. Zonkong danced a semicircle at Sorata, and quickly slashed forward. One knife flow swallow return. What? Mahawk was forced to take a step back by the force from Sorata's blade. When he stood firm and looked forward, suddenly, the three sword lights in front of him attracted all his attention. This is the slash that slashed Kizaru. Feeling the piercing chill from the neck, chest, and lower limbs at the same time, Mahawk's pupils contracted and his eyes glowed red. Three knives, all true. This is what he saw. His observation hockey has reached a very high level. Although he doesn't have any special abilities, coupled with his natural sharp eagle eyes that can see the essence of things, the combination of the two gives his eyes the ability to see through everything. He called this characteristic, Eagle's Eye. The Eagle's Eye not only made his swordsmanship, but also gave him the essence of being able to fight against any enemy. 3 cuts with one knife. Mahawk stared at Zonkong, who had completely disappeared, as if seeing the real Zankong. He quickly retracted the knife, and then slashed out forcefully. Advertisement: the same 1 cut and 3 cuts. Clang, clang. Then 3 beeps and only 1 beep. Clang, the blade light disappeared, and Zonkong and Yi's blades collided again. Sorata faced the shockwave, her silver hair danced wildly backwards, her eyes narrowed slightly, staring solemnly at Mahawk's eyes. It actually penetrated the essence of his swordsmanship at a glance, and he used it quickly. What the hell is this? Did you find it? Mahawk stared at Sorata, noticed the doubt in Sorata's eyes, and said with a smile. My eyes can easily see through the essence of all things, so all your sword skills are in my eyes, and there is no secret at all. Is this the essence of this guy's strength? Sorata stared at Mahawk, his eyes flickered with clarity. No wonder this guy never used sword skills, so he knows all kinds of sword skills. He thought this guy had reached the realm he imagined. Also, how could anyone reach that level? That is not human at all, but the realm of gods. Judging from the short fight just now, their swinging speeds are about the same, and their knowledge are not the same. But this guy's arm color is much stronger than him, but it doesn't get in the way. The most troublesome thing is this guy's eyes. This guy's eyes make his swinging a knife completely without any secrets at all, turning his swinging a knife into a random slashing. It's really pervert. This guy's eyes can be said to be the nemesis of all those who rely on skills to fight against the enemy. Unless the difference in strength is too large, or the speed exceeds him, otherwise, the only way to compete with this guy is to compete in physical strength. Because no matter how powerful the swordsmanship is, in this guy's eyes, there is no secret at all. Judging from this guy's ultra-long-range slash, this guy's physical strength is also at the monster level. There is no flaw. No wonder, he can be called the #1 swordsman in the world. At this time, he would definitely not be able to beat Mahawk with only swordsmanship, but he didn't want to use his space ability. After all, it's just a sparring session. Forget it, go wherever you can. His body is still growing rapidly, and Conqueror's Haki, he believes that it will not be long before he can surpass Mahawk both physically and swordsmanship. Because this guy can't Conqueror's Haki. Once he can actually do Conquerors, it's time for this guy to step down from the #1 spot. Now, just enjoy the battle. First thing, think about it later. He flicked Yi's blade away and jumped backward. Advertisement. Lightly landed on the ground, retracted the left hand, and waved the right hand downward. Hold the knife at an angle. Then he tore off the wine gourd around his waist with his left hand, raised his head and drank heavily. Goo. Huh. Sorata put down the gourd, shook her head, and exhaled a strong smell of alcohol. Cool. Then he hung the wine gourd around his waist, with his right hand down, and inserted it into the ground, then retracted his hands in the sleeves, and the upper body of the moon-white robe slid off, revealing the strong body like bronze inside. Okay, the warm-up is over, let's fight hard. Sorata stared at Mahawk, chuckled, stretched out her right hand and pulled out Zonkong. I think so too. Mahawk stared at Sorata, reached out to take off the hat on his head, and threw it aside. With his skill, the hat spun and hung quickly on the branch of a tree in the distance. Come on. Mahawk held the knife in both hands and stared at Sorata with excitement in his eyes. What follows is the main purpose of the sparring. He sat in the #1 seat for too long, repeatedly. The shockwave was like an ocean wave, one wave after another, pushing the trees and weeds on the island, centered on the battle between the two, and bending around. These swordmasters on the Grand Line are either guys whose strength is so different from his that they can't even take a single blow from him, or they're people who can take his slashes but can't fight him for a long time. The sword is the most ruthless. Clang, looking at it from a distance, it has long been impossible to tell which is the sea and which is the cloud. He enjoys the feeling of fighting with other swordsmen, because only the fighting between swordsmen can make people concentrate, because if they are not careful, they may be cut by the opponent. During the flash of the knife light, the figure of the knife could not be seen at all, only 2 black knife lights could be seen, intertwined, then separated and intertwined. He has been looking for an opponent all these years, but he has never been able to find one. The hurricane was raging, the white waves rolled, and even the clouds in the sky also rolled. This feeling of being on the verge of death at any time is the most addictive and the most growth-provoking. As the two continued to fight, the shockwave even rushed out of the island, rolling up real waves in the nearby sea area. That's why he was so excited about Sorata's appearance. Because he saw the possibility of surpassing him from Sorata. This possibility is not a delusion, but a real seeing and feeling. Along with the sound of collision, there were bursts of shockwaves. Zonkong and Yi collided together for the 3rd time, then quickly separated, then collided again, and separated again. For a person who is obsessed with swords, there is no opponent, it is too lonely. Sparks flew. Chapter 78 Confidant on the Sword Road. The hurricane formed by the shockwave lasted for 2 days and 2 nights. During these 2 days, the sound of blades colliding on the island and the shockwaves never stopped. When the sun rises on the 3rd day, the sky and the earth are golden. The hurricane and sound that had been blasting outwards from the island stopped. Have you stopped? On the side of the island, on the boulder? Ahua yawned, and they watched as long as the two of Sorata fought. At first they were very excited, but as time went by, they gradually lost interest. If it weren't for the sound of the collision of knives that kept ringing, and the hurricane formed by the shockwave kept blowing, making the Liberty keep shaking, They had already returned to the Liberty and went to sleep. In the past 2 days, they cooked on the temporary stove built on the shore. Awa, go prepare some food. Kuina withdrew her gaze, her eyes were bloodshot. Among them, she was the one who looked the most seriously, and she was the only one who could truly see the strength and status of the opponents. I have to say, the #1 swordsman in the world really deserves his reputation. From her point of view, Sorata was at a disadvantage from the very beginning. Although she fought Mihawk back and forth, most of the time, Sorata was in a particularly dangerous situation. Of course, based on her understanding of Sorata, as long as Sorata is unwilling, Mihawk will never hurt him even if he is twice as strong. So although she was surprised by Mihawk's strength, she wasn't worried about Sorata at all. She turned her head to look at Awa and said, "The two of them must be very hungry after fighting for so long, you go and prepare more food." As he said that, he looked at Adao and Eluo, "You two should help too." To understanding, the three of Ahua turned their heads to look at Kuina and quickly answered loudly. Then he turned around, jumped aboard the Liberty, and headed for the kitchen. With the truce between the two people in the middle of the island, the hurricane and waves gradually stopped. Although the Liberty is still shaking at this time, it has already made people stand firm on it. So cooking is still possible. Kalkalkalkok, Indigo grinned, looked back at the center of the island, turned to look at Kuina, and said with a smile, "Cooking? I'll help too. The captain's monster-like physique. 2 days of fighting must be a lot. Food is enough to eat." "Okay." Kuina nodded, looked at Indigo, and smiled, "Thank you for your hard work." Kalakal. Indigo waved his hand, turned and jumped into the boat. Puff, advertisement puff, puff, into the kitchen. In the middle of the island, the ground was originally covered with piles of rubble, but now there was not a single stone to be found. The flat ground is covered with large and small potholes and countless cracks. Some cracks go deep into the island and connect to the ocean, and the seawater is constantly surging outward through the cracks. I believe that it won't be long before a strange central lake will be formed here. The surrounding upright trees were all rounded and curved outwards. Even if the two stopped fighting at this time, these trees would always be fixed in a curved shape. On the edge of a crack, Sorata bent over, and Zon Kong stuck on the ground in front of him, while his hands were on the handle of Zon Kong's knife, breathing heavily. Fighting this guy is exhausting. Sorata looked up and stared at Mihawk with pleasure in his eyes. But it's worth being tired, as he deserves to be the #1 swordsman in the world, which has benefited him a lot. Some of his slightly blunt sword skills have been greatly improved. This kind of battle that requires a high degree of concentration all the time to deal with the slash that comes at any time, made him fight so happily for the first time since he went to sea. Fighting Mihawk is much better than fighting Golden Lion and Kizaru. Golden Lion was getting old, and although he pulled off the rudder behind, he was able to fight against him briefly and suppress him, but with his improvement in the decline of Golden Lion's physical strength, he could not give him pleasure in subsequent battles. That guy Kizaru is not a pure swordsman, although he can fight swordsmanship with him, but most of the time he uses his fruit ability to deal with him, so there is no joy in fighting. Mihawk is different. This guy is a pure swordsman. All confrontations are fierce collisions of knives. This kind of collision between pure swordsmen is like the collision of two passionate boxers. Blood-boiling, full of joy. But it's a little exhausting. Mihawk's swordsmanship is indeed much better than him. This is impossible. This guy's talent is the top in the world, and his age is at the peak. If he didn't have the monster-like physique bestowed by the spatial physique, he would never have been able to fight this guy for so long. Many times, this guy's knife actually cut him. If it weren't for the passive space layer defense on the surface of his body, he might have been injured long ago. After resting for a while, Sorata gradually straightened out her breath and stopped panting so much. He straightened his waist, exerted strength with his right hand, pulled out Zonkong, turned his wrist, and danced a saber flower. Ding, sheathed the knife. Then he tore off the wine gourd with his left hand, bent his thumb, hooked his nails around the mouth of the gourd, and flicked it upwards. Boo! The cork popped open, and the aroma of the wine overflowed. He raised the wine gourd, raised his head, and his throat kept moving. Goo goo. Advertisement, huh. Sorata breathed out the smell of alcohol, the corners of her mouth split open, and she roared loudly, "Have fun." Ha 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 ha. Then he looked down at Mihawk and laughed loudly. "You guys are really strong, it's really cool to compete with you. Do you want to have a bite?" Saying so, Sorata put the stopper on the wine gourd, and threw it hard at Mihawk. Mihawk stared at Sorata, the corners of his mouth turned up in a smile. This battle not only made Sorata happy, but why didn't he too? Although Sorata's swordsmanship is a bit inferior to his, but whether it is reaction speed, swing speed, or strength, it can be said that it is almost the same as him. Such strength at such a young age, so, what about the future? Worth looking forward to. In fact, he has always hoped that there will be someone who has the strength to seize his position as the #1 in the world. He didn't care too much about this position, intersect each other. Sorata is his other opponent on the sword path after Shanks, and of course, he is also a confidant. He threw the wine gourd back to Sorata, then stepped aside, picked up the wine-red coat that was on the ground, shook off the dust on it, and put it on his body. Then he put down the wine gourd, a blush flashed across his face, he stared at Sorata, and laughed loudly. Sorata watched Mihawk come over, hung the wine gourd around his waist, and put his hand around his shoulder. Snapped, ha 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 ha. This was the first time in so many years that he laughed so happily. He turned around, faced the rising sun, and headed towards the Liberty on the side of the island. Is it possible not to feel happy when you make a good friend? Then he took off the hat hanging on the branch, put it on his head, and returned to the appearance of the world's #1 swordsman. All he cares about is being able to have an opponent. The figures of the two of them were illuminated by the morning light, and the shadows behind them stretched out to the elders, like two sharp swords. In the days without opponents, it was too boring and lonely. From now on, we are more friends. He raised his head and took a few sips. Mahawk took the wine gourd thrown by Sorata, flicked off the cork, imitating Sorata's appearance, and didn't mind whether there was any saliva left by Sorata just drinking on the mouth of the gourd. It was also the first time in so many years that he was so happy. Chapter 79 Evil. Grand Line. A certain uncharted sea. A luxuriously decorated three-masted cruise ship, escorted by two giant warships from naval headquarters on the left and right, is rapidly heading forward. On the top of the cruise ship, a flag with a gorgeous golden shield inlaid in the center is fluttering in the wind. One can tell at a glance that this ship is not a pirate ship, let alone a merchant ship. On the bow deck of the luxury cruise ship, a teenage kid in gorgeous clothes was riding excitedly on a strong man with a naked upper body crawling on his knees. On the back of the strong man, there is a layer of gorgeous thick blanket, while the little boy is sitting on the blanket, holding the rope extending from the man's neck with one hand, and waving the whip in his other hand, clasped the man's sides with his legs, and yelled loudly towards the front. Like a heroic knight riding a horse, snapped, snapped. Snapped, drive. Every time the child waved his hand, the man under him couldn't help but tremble. But the trembling was not very obvious, so the child didn't feel anything. After a while, the man's back, bare parts, and buttocks were covered with blood-red marks, and some places were still seeping blood. In fact, these scars are minor injuries to the man's entire body. On the man's back and chest, there are more giant long wounds that have stuttered like centipedes. Although his whole body was full of scars, there was no pain in the man's eyes. It was as if his body was not his. Although his body trembled slightly under the child's whip, his pupils were as calm as a deep well, gray, numb, and devoid of emotion. Crash. Crash. The man's feet and hands were locked with chains, and the heavy chains rubbed against the deck, making a sound like running water. Although it is soft, it is particularly harsh to the ears of those with a heart. It's just that the people on the bow of the boat couldn't hear it at this time. Your Highness, this mount is okay. Beside the man stood a thin man in a black butler suit. The man bent his waist, raised his head, and flattered the little boy on the man's back. This mount is specially reserved for you by the king. It is said that this guy used to be the guard of a small town. As he said that, the butler stretched out his right foot, kicked the man, lowered his head, looked at the explosive muscles on the man's body, and a trace of disgust flashed in his eyes. He doesn't like strong men, and thinks that those with muscles are barbarians. Guardian. The little boy became interested. He stopped waving the whip in his hand, and turned to look at the steward. Steward, tell me quickly, since this guy is a guard, there should be more slaves in their village. Why is there only one person? Hearing this, the man's body paused slightly, and a ripple appeared in his pupils like stagnant water, sparking a glimmer of light, but thinking of something, the ripple quickly calmed down, and the light disappeared, as if did not appear the same. The butler lowered his head, stared at the man, and kicked the man again. Advertisement. This guy's village actually hides wanted criminals. When the king found out, he reduced all the people in the village to slaves. Except for this guy, everyone else was sold off, of course. After finishing speaking, the butler raised his head, looked at the child, and said with a sneer, Your Highness, you said that this guy is funny enough, but he still wanted to resist. After being caught, he was severely taught by the king for a long time, so he is honest. Oh, the little boy's interest came and went even faster. He was only interested in slaves, and when he heard that there were no other slaves, he lost interest immediately. He turned his head and continued to swing the long whip. Snapped, the housekeeper looked at the child's back, then lowered his head, looked at the man. An inexplicable smile flashed in his eyes. Of course not all the slaves were sold. His Highness is still too young for some things. Without the king's permission, he dare not talk to His Highness privately about women's affairs. Below the deck, in a luxurious room, a group of people in gorgeous clothes were standing behind a middle-aged man wearing a crown. At this moment, they all stared at the big turntable in front of them excitedly. I guess it's the head this time. A fat man withdrew his gaze, turned his head to stare at the back of the man wearing the crown, and flattered loudly. With His Majesty's aim, this knife will definitely hit. Ha ha ha. You don't need to say that the king's throwing skills are the best in the country. The crowd immediately responded loudly. Their Majesty the king was staring frantically at the front, raised the knife in his hand, and threw it forward vigorously. Whoosh! The flying knife moves forward quickly, puff. He inserted it without hesitation, and the arm of a masked man tied to the big turntable in front of him. What? Ultimate's pain made the masked man couldn't help but yelled. Ha 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 ha. I missed the shot. The king turned his head around, listening to the masked man's shouts, as if he heard the most beautiful voice in the world. His eyes flashed with morbid joy, and his face flushed. Bring the knife. The maid kneeling next to him quickly knelt forward and raised the tray in her hand. The tray was full of knives. Ha ha. The turntable must have moved just now, which made the king miss the shot. This time he will definitely hit it. Everyone nodded quickly. The king reached for a pocket knife and threw it away without aiming it. Whoosh, advertisement, what, this knife still missed. Hearing the cry, the joy in the king's eyes became heavier. Kill me. The man on the turntable couldn't bear the torture of ultimate any longer, he leaned forward and struggled crazily. Kill me, I beg you to kill me, what, wanna die? The king and ministers looked at the man on the turntable with crazy eyes and flushed faces. Where is this, it's still far away, ha 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 ha. The king reached out, continued to take the knife, and continued to shoot. After a while, the man's body was full of knives, and his screams became smaller, and finally he couldn't scream anymore. He shook his head and fell limply on the turntable. Puff, another knife was inserted into the man's thigh. This time there was no shouting, and the madness in everyone's eyes receded. Boring. The king put down the knife in his hand, turned around, walked through the passage made aside by everyone behind him, and walked towards the door. Go, next show. The guards weighing on both sides of the turntable stood indifferently from the beginning to the end, until the king put down the knife in his hand. Then they quickly untied the man on the turntable, and then lifted him up like a dead dog. He quickly walked out of the room. Obviously, they have long been familiar with such a scene. The action is professional and skilled. After the guards walked out of the room, the maid in the room quickly picked up the water basin at the side, knelt on the ground, and skillfully cleaned up the bloodline on the ground. After a while, the luxurious room returned to its original appearance, as if the inhumane incident just now had never happened here. But from the strong smell of blood that kept coming out of the room, one could know that everything just now was not an illusion. And this room is just one of the rooms in this ship. After leaving the room, there is a brightly lit aisle, and in the aisle, there are more rooms. And each room represents a program. The king led the ministers out of the room just now, hesitated for a moment in the aisle, and then pushed open a door without hesitation and walked in. The room was pitch black, like a gate leading to hell. And the king and ministers are obviously not heroes who came to fight against the devil. The door closes. After a while, another scream came from inside, but this time it was no longer a man's voice, but a female's. Chapter 80. You can always trust the brat's ability to cause trouble. Your Highness. On the deck of a luxury cruise ship. A guard quickly ran from the rear to the bow, looked at the little boy's back and shouted loudly. Your Highness, there is a ship ahead. Oh, what ship is it? I don't know, the distance is too far to see the flag clearly. The little boy prince quickly stopped what he was doing, dropped the whip, jumped off the man's back, and reached out to take the telescope handed over by the guard. He excitedly ran to the bow, raised the binoculars, and put it in front of his eyes. Through the lens, he could see a small sailing boat heading towards them at a fast speed. It's really a boat. The little boy put down the binoculars, clapped his hands excitedly, then turned his head to stare at the guards, and said loudly, hurry up and push out my cannon. To understanding. The guard quickly turned around, walked into the next cabin, and pushed out a huge cannon from inside. Your Highness, let's take a closer look at what kind of ship the opponent is before firing. The housekeeper looked at the excited child and quickly persuaded him. Along the way, they bombarded 5 or 6 ships, including merchant ships and pirate ships, if not for the deterrence of 2 warships. Maybe they were wiped out by the pirates long ago. Don't look at them as if they are very majestic, with a posture of not taking human life seriously, but that is only in their own country that they can have no scruples. They went out to sea, but no one recognized the flag representing the kingdom on their boat. Are you teaching me how to do things? Hearing the butler's words, the little boy turned his head to stare at the butler. The smile on his face disappeared, and turned indifferent. Although he looked like a child, he exuded a murderous aura all over his body. Apparently, this kid has already killed quite a few people. No. The housekeeper trembled from fright at the indifferent eyes of the little boy, and his face paled quickly. Don't think that his life is valuable even if he is the steward of the ship. Actually, on this ship. Do not, it is their entire country, only the lives of the king's family are valuable. All the people in this country are, so to speak, slaves of the king's family. They have the right to decide anyone's life or death. Boom, advertisement. He quickly fell to his knees, lowered his head, and kowtowed on the ground non-stop. Boom 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 boom. Slaves deserve to die. You shouldn't disturb His Highness's interest. I beg your Highness to be merciful. Since I have served the royal family for so many years, just treat me as a fart and let me go. As he spoke, he raised his head and looked at the child expectantly. The child met the housekeeper's eyes, his eyes flickered, he turned around, and waved his hands. Forget it, get out. It's a disappointment. If you say something like this next time, you're going to die. Don't forget your identity. We are just slaves of our family. When did slaves talk about masters? Yes. Your Highness said, I'll get out now, get out now. Looking at the back of the child, the butler heaved a sigh of relief. He didn't dare to get up, and he didn't even dare to wipe the sweat from his head. Kneel, move your legs, and move them back quickly. The guard on the side, seeing all this, has long been used to it. His face is full of calm, but when he saw the butler wriggling back like a maggot, there was a hint of sarcasm in his eyes. This guy usually shouted in front of their guards, but now facing His Highness, he was just like them, just a dog. What are you doing in a daze, and you haven't fired the shells yet? The child put down the binoculars and stared at the guard, with impatience flashing across his face. Oh, okay, let's let it go, let's let it go. Hearing the child's yelling, the guard trembled. Panic suddenly appeared on his calm face. He quickly picked up a shell from the shell basket on one side, and quickly stuffed it into the barrel of the artillery. Then he skillfully picked up a torch from one side, took out the lighter and lit it, and handed it to the child. Your Highness, the shells have been filled and the orientation has been corrected, so they can be launched. This is not the first time the guard has played shelling games with the children, and everything is very skillful. The child took the torch and looked at the sea in the distance. He could already see the shadow of the small sailboat without a telescope, and a smile appeared on his face again. His eyes widened, he raised the torch excitedly, and lit the cannon's fuse without hesitation. Boom, thick smoke rose, and amidst the flickering fire, a black shell rushed out of the barrel and quickly moved towards the small sailboat in the distance. What? On the watchtower on the mast of the Liberty, Arlo suddenly sensed something, and a red light flashed in his eyes. He put down the binoculars in his hand, turned his head, stared at the front left, his eyes turned cold. Isn't this courting death? They had discovered the marine and the luxury cruise ship a long time ago. Since the opposite side was not a pirate ship, and their routes happened to be staggered with each other, they would not meet each other, so they ignored it. Looking at the rapidly falling shell from the sky, he quickly pulled out the long-barreled sniper rifle from his waist and put it on his shoulder. This gun was found on Waipol's Iron King, and while it's not particularly good, it's just about adequate. He holds the gun in his left hand, holds the gun handle in his right hand, hooks the trigger with his index finger, a stream of black hockey, from his arm, gradually follows his fingers, rushes upwards, quickly pours into the barrel, and finally wraps around the barrel on the bullet. He suffered countless beatings in Little Garden, and also fought 2 Titan warriors. The armament hockey of the 3 of them had already awakened. It's just that their armament hockey is not like Kuina and Sorata. Although they are also awakened, the amount of their hockey is very different from Kuina and Sorata. Advertisement now their armament hockey can only be wound at best, and it can't even cover a large area, nor can it last. And if you want to continue to improve, I am afraid that you have to evolve your body again, improve your physical fitness, increase the amount of hockey, and then continue to improve through exercise. But this cannot be done in a short time. Even with the help of the Radish and Sorata domains, if they want to improve, they still have to go through a lot of training and further development of the fruit before they can improve. No way, their physical talents determine the upper limit of their achievements. If it weren't for the Zone Devil Fruit, for the improvement of their physical fitness, they wouldn't be able to awaken hockey in this life. But compared to a Dao and a Wa, he is much luckier. Because he awakened observation hockey which only Kuina and Sorata have. This made his shooting more accurate and the distance farther. Before he awakened observation hockey, he was just an ordinary shooter. Although he has the blessing of Devil Fruit, his perception is not far away and not so convenient, so he is only slightly stronger than ordinary gunners. Now, with the blessings of armament hockey and observation hockey, plus the ant fruit endowed him with sharp double horns. He felt that he was the top shooter in the world at this time. Boom, sometimes let them shell. With a whoosh, it quickly moved towards the shell that was completely out of proportion to the bullet. Bullets and shells meet in the air. Forget about the pirate ship. Boom, Marine, who noticed the movement, all turned their heads to stare at the right front shrouded in thick smoke, with disgust flashing in their eyes. Snapped, actually let them bombard merchant ships. It's that disgusting prince bombarding passing ships again. All the ships they encountered along the way, such as His Royal Highness, would be bombarded. The trigger is pulled. Flames flickered and smoke rose, covering the Liberty inside. While the orange light was flashing, a black bullet rushed out of the barrel, piercing the air. The cannonball froze in the air for a moment, and then exploded like a firework. If he was given a high-quality sniper rifle, he would be sure to shoot everything he could perceive in his sight. If it wasn't for the countries that joined the world government, they would have arrested that guy as a pirate. Without any pause or obstruction, the bullet pierced directly through the cannonball and continued to move forward. Chapter 81 Frightened. Yay. One hit. On the bow of the cruise ship, the child stepped on the barrel behind the cannon with an excited face, turned his head to stare at the guards standing behind him, and shouted loudly. Hey, hurry up and reload. Seeing that the guards were unmoved, a trace of displeasure flashed in the child's eyes. What are you doing in a daze? Do you want to die? Hey. The child was taken aback for a moment. He put away his feet that were on the gun barrel, put his feet on the ground, turned around, stared at the guards, and stared fiercely. At this moment, he suddenly discovered something. The excited expression on his face disappeared immediately, his eyes widened, his pupils shrank, and his face turned pale, as if he had seen a ghost. Hey, when? Just kidding. He stared at the guard's forehead with disbelief on his face. Is this something a human can do? I didn't know when. The guard had completely stopped breathing, while his eyes were fixed on the front, and there was still excitement in his pupils. As if until death, he was still fantasizing that the opponent's ship was swallowed up by cannon fodder in an instant under the attack of the shells. Following the guard's eyes upward, he saw a bullet hole pierced through the front and back, embedded in his forehead. Through the hole in the forehead, the sails behind the cruise ship can be easily seen. While the child was in a daze, the hole in the guard's forehead was instantly filled with blood, and then, like a water gun, it sprayed out along the hole. See. The liquid between the red baixiang sprayed the child all over. At this moment, the guard was completely dead, his legs went limp, and he threw himself straight at the little boy. The little boy was stunned by the blood spurted by the guard. Seeing the guard falling towards him, he quickly backed away, shouting loudly as he retreated. "What?" The voice is sharp and loud. "Come on, escort, escort." Boom, the little boy's footsteps were backwards, and he couldn't control his pace well, so he accidentally tripped and sat down on the deck. Boom, at this moment, the guard's body just fell to the ground, and there was a low sound, and the guard's head was stuck between the little boy's legs. His face was forward, and those eyes were bleeding, staring straight at the little boy. The gray pupils, like black holes, instantly attracted the little boy's mind. It was as if a pair of invisible hands were dragging his soul, trying to make him fall into hell together. "What?" An even louder shout rose from the boy's mouth. "Advertisement, what happened?" Boom 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 boom. A series of footsteps came from the rear of the cruise ship. As the footsteps approached, a group of soldiers wearing the same uniform as the dead guards quickly rushed across the deck and stood on the bow. A tall man who was obviously the leader of the guards, after seeing the scene on the bow deck, quickly kicked away the guards lying between the little boy's legs, and bent down to pull the little boy up. "Your Highness, are you okay? What happened here?" He glanced at the guard lying on the ground, dying with regret. When he saw the bullet hole on the guard's forehead, his pupils shrank, and he quickly knelt down in front of the little boy with a bang. The other guards behind him also quickly knelt down and lowered their heads, not daring to look directly at the little boy. Only the leading guard raised his head, looked at the little boy and said, "Your Highness, this dog slave actually made His Highness unhappy. You deserve it if you die. This dog slave must have scared you." When he saw the bullet hole, he thought that the guard had offended the little boy, so he was shot and killed by the little boy. He didn't know how many times he had seen this situation. Only this time it's a little weird. Every time the little boy finished killing someone, he always looked excited. Why is his face full of fear this time? As for the blood all over the little boy's body, he was not surprised. It's not like he hadn't seen it before. Don't give him time to think about it. The little boy came back to his senses and stared at the kneeling guards in front of him, as if he suddenly gained confidence. He looked up at the leader of the guards, and the panic in his eyes disappeared instantly. "Quick! Go and roll out more cannons for me. I want the Shinso on the opposite ship to be my slave." As he spoke, he stood up quickly, a flush flashed across his face. The little boy was only in his teens, and he grew up surrounded by the compliments of countless people, thinking that everyone in the world was just like his own people, allowing him to seize and oppress him. Although he was shocked by the sudden death of the guard before, he has recovered now. So what about Shinso hands? His country is not without Shinso hands. As long as he wants to, he has to lie on the ground obediently and be his slave. Shinso hand? Doubt flashed across the face of the guard leader, and then he turned his head and glanced at the dead guard's forehead. My heart skipped a beat. He is not a little boy. The Shinso hands in their country are not at the same level as the Shinso hands in the Grand Line. Earlier, he thought it was the guard who was shot and killed by the little boy, so he was so confident. But now, he withdrew his gaze, stood up quickly, looked at the artillery, and followed the direction of the barrel to the direction of the sea in the distance. This glance. Advertisement, just a glance. It made him feel as if he had been given a body-holding technique, and his whole body froze in place. No way. No. You won't be so unlucky, right? He stared wide-eyed, looking forward, his face full of disbelief. Hey. The little boy stared up at the leader of the guards, stretched out his foot, and kicked him hard. What are you doing? Don't hurry up. Go. As he spoke, he kicked again. Seeing that the leader of the guard was unmoved, he turned his head to look behind the leader of the guard. When they saw the leader of the guards who stood up all froze in place like the leader of the guards. His face suddenly darkened, and he shouted loudly, I said, what's the matter with you guards? Do you all want to die? A trace of tyranny flashed in his eyes as he spoke. However, the little boy's tyrannical aura that would have made the guards tremble in the past has no effect at this moment. The guard leader ignored the little boy. Although he knew that he might get into trouble at this time, he was not afraid. Thinking of this, his body trembled. He walked forward, grabbed the clothes of the leader of the guards, shook, and shouted loudly. The way these guards looked now, they were clearly afraid, more scared than usual when facing him and his father who were angry. The existence that can scare the guards so much must be some great big pirate. Tick. After speaking, he took a step back, drew out the golden pistol on his waist, raised it, and pointed the muzzle at the head of the guard leader. As if he had encountered the most terrifying thing in the world, he seemed to have lost his ability to act. At this time, the little boy could already feel that something was wrong. Tick. Because they are going to participate in the World Summit this time, and they are escorted by 2 marine warships. Countless sweat gushed out from the guards, soaking their clothes in an instant, while the sweat on their foreheads gathered on their chins, condensed into water droplets, and dripped down continuously. Tick. Hey. Wake me up. If you don't wake up again, I'll kill you. Although the little boy is cruel, he is not a fool. Tell me quickly who the other party is. If you don't tell me, I will kill you right now. His eyes stared straight ahead, pupils constricted to ultimate. Chapter 82. Killing intent. At this time, on the warships on both sides of the cruise ship, alarm bells sounded at the same time. Since even the guards on the cruise ship can recognize the flag on the sailboat in front. How could Marine not know them? After 4 months of fermentation, I believe that as long as you mix on the Grand Line, no one will know what that windmill flag represents. On the warship, Marine soldiers looked at the approaching Liberty. Although nervous, but not afraid. These two ships are not newbies like Keto, and the Marines on board are all veterans. So they all stayed quietly on the deck without any unnecessary movements. Facing a pirate group like Silver Hair, open fire. Isn't that too long to live, courting death? Kudu? When the Marines saw clearly the silvery moon-white figure standing on the bow of the small sailing boat in front of them under the sunlight, he swallowed involuntarily. From their spiritual perspective, as the Liberty approached, it seemed as if the sky had darkened at this time. The growing sense of oppression in the spirit made their foreheads sweat profusely, and their breathing became short of breath. The sense of oppression is too strong. On the bow of the cruise ship, the leader of the guards stared at the figures on the bow of the Liberty, and was shivered by the sea breeze. He hastily withdrew his gaze, not daring to look at Liberty, for fear that his gaze would attract the other party's attention. Only then did he see the angry little boy with a flushed face in front of him. The head of the guard ignored the gun in the boy's hand. He stared into the little boy's eyes, and said eagerly, Dia, your highness. After taking a breath, he stroked his tongue, silver-haired pirates, let's go. The silver-haired pirates? Little boy hand loose. Boom. The golden pistol quickly fell on the deck. He looked at the leader of the guards, his face full of disbelief, and then his angry face quickly turned from red to white, and his pupils were terrified. Although his country is not on the main route of the Grand Line, he never misses the news in this world. Although he usually doesn't pay attention to those news, he happened to read the news about the silver hair pirates that shocked the world a few months ago. He never thought that he would meet a pirate with a bounty of 1.5 billion, so he focused all his attention on the bounty of 1.5 billion, and he was not interested in the others, so he didn't even look at them. That's why I didn't recognize the windmill flag representing the silver hair pirates. Advertisement. He withdrew his gaze from staring at the leader of the guards, raised his legs, lowered his head and turned around in circles. How to do. As for the general pirate group with 2 marine warships to guard him, of course he needn't be afraid. But opposite is the silver hair pirates. No matter how arrogant and ignorant he is, he lives on the Grand Line after all, so it is impossible not to know the gold content of the 1.5 billion reward. That's them. That was a character they couldn't face with the addition of 2 marine warships. The leader of the guards looked at the flustered little boy with a trace of helplessness in his eyes. If he knows, what should he do? Should he still be so afraid? He raised his head, glanced ahead, swallowed, and lowered his head to stare at the little boy. Your Highness, it's better to hide, you can't run away. The little boy stopped walking. Yes, hide. If the silver-haired gang wants to kill or rob, let him rob. Quick, go. As he spoke, he quickly walked past the head of the guards and walked towards the cabin. He is going to find his father. Now only by staying with his father can he feel safe. See. At this moment, in front of the little boy and behind the guards, a moon-white figure appeared silently like a dream bubble. Looking at the figure that suddenly appeared, the little boy hurriedly stopped on the spot. Tread, the footsteps landed, and there was a dull and small sound. With the appearance of the sound, the bubble was like a mirage, gradually becoming clear in a burst of space ripples. Yo, boy, are you the one who fired at us? Sorata looked down at the child, the corners of her mouth turned up in a smile. No, it's not me, but my guard. The boy stared at Sorata, his face pale, his pupils constricted into a single point, in ultimate horror. As soon as Sorata appeared, although he didn't exude any aura, he could feel the breath of death from his body. It was a breath of death like a black hole, pulling his soul and falling into a dark abyss. He usually exudes this aura when he abuses slaves and kills people, so he is very familiar with it. If it is said that he killed with a knife, then Sorata at this time is itself a black hole. He looked at Sorata and felt the hairs all over his body stand on end. Advertisement, dangerous, extremely dangerous. Sorata looked at the little boy with a strange flash in his eyes. Why is this guy so afraid of him? He didn't exude any momentum. He rubbed his chin, thought for a while, and looked at the little boy, his eyes flashed red. Staring at the little boy, the smile on his face gradually disappeared. So small, so evil. After fighting Kizaru 4 months ago, with his knowledge, he can vaguely sense the good and evil in the deepest part of the heart. After practicing in Little Garden for 4 months, he competed with Mahawk as soon as he came out, which completely improved his knowledge. Now he can sense all the emotions in the hearts of people and animals, and he can also see the good and evil in the deepest part of their hearts. A kind-hearted person, in his eyes, everything he sees is bright. If it is an evil person, no matter how glamorous his appearance is and how well he hides it, in his eyes, he is full of tyranny, gloom, and darkness. And this little boy exuded a disgusting and brutal aura that he particularly loathed. From his reddened aura, he could sense that this little boy must have killed countless people. So small, he dare not imagine. Sorata ignored the little boy, his eyes glowed red, observation hockey swept across the entire cruise ship and 2 warships in an instant. Sudden, in the perception of everyone in this sea area. The sky darkened. Click, thunder was born out of thin air, purple-red thunder and lightning filled the entire sky. Rumble, countless thunderbolts, like purple-red snakes, collided in the sky. An incomparable murderous intent soared into the sky from the bow of the cruise ship. Quickly rushed around. Boom, boom, boom. Whether it was the guards or the marine, at this moment, they all felt a murderous intent that made their hairs stand on end. This murderous intent carried endless oppression, as if the entire sky was pressing down on them, making them bend down involuntarily. Some Marines, who were not mentally firm enough, fell to their knees directly on the ground under Sorata's killing intent. Chapter 83 Shitai Reese on the warship on the left. A middle-aged man with a mustache, combed back hair, wearing an orange suit, yellow tie, and Marine Vice Admiral cape looked up at the sky. Is it possible to do this? It's really scary? Actually combined the killing intent with Conqueror's hockey. Although that guy's Conqueror's hockey was not aimed at them, the indiscriminate pressure brought by the murderous intent was not easy at all. In his eyes, the world seems to be divided into two layers. The sky on the first layer is sunny, and the sky on the first layer is full of purple thunder, so gloomy that it looks like it is about to collapse. Obviously, everything in front of me is an illusion brought about by the combination of the silver-haired killer and Conqueror's hockey. He didn't know why the silver hair was so angry. Judging from the information Marine has, it seems that the silver-haired guy has never lost his temper since he went to sea. Could it be? He was so lucky to meet the angry silver hair. Uncomfortable. He is the Vice Admiral, Steel Reese, who escorted the Kingdom of Gamma. This time. These two warships are both his fleet. Although the Gamma Island where the Gamma Kingdom is located is not on the main routes of the Grand Line, the island is not large and the population is not large. But on the islands of this country, there are some special materials needed by the world government, so this country is not a small country like the Drum Kingdom, but a country with a special status for the world government. Moreover, the king's family of this country is particularly rich, and their status is the most powerful nobleman under the Celestial Dragons. That's why he, Vice Admiral of Naval Headquarters, came to escort him in person. Steve Reese shook his head, looked ahead and turned around, as if the Liberty was leading them on a voyage, with a gleam in his eyes. The silver-haired gang is not a gang of pirates who kill indiscriminately. Let's go and see why that guy is so angry. Thinking of this, he turned his head and looked behind him, the many Marine soldiers kneeling on the deck with blank eyes, and shook his head. It seems that when we go back, we need to train these guys well. It was just a small amount of Conqueror's hockey's killing intent, and that's it. After that, when I really met Conqueror's hockey, I fell to the ground in an instant. Colonel Dormer. Exist, behind Steve Reese, a man in a colonel's overcoat shook his head to dispel the illusion in front of him. This illusion can also affect some Marines who are not determined enough, but it can't affect him. He turned and walked quickly towards Steel Reese. Walking to Shitai Reese, he stood at attention and gave a military salute. Master Vice Admiral, what's the matter? Steve Reese turned his head and said to Dormer. Go and put up the sails, stop the boat. Advertisement, stop the ship. Doubt flashed across Dormer's face. Isn't stopping the ship a chance for the silver-haired gang to board the ship? If we don't stop, won't they be able to climb up? Dormer was speechless. What about the cruise ship of Gamma Kingdom? He turned his head and looked in the direction of the cruise ship with serious eyes. The silver hair was on the cruise ship, and the murderous intent came from the cruise ship. There at the bow of the ship, the deck of the military aircraft is high, and they cannot see the bow of the cruise ship. Although they couldn't see it, they still knew exactly where the murderous intent that soared into the sky came from. With such a strong momentum, only silver hair can do it. Silver hair is on the cruise ship. Don't worry about the cruise ship, maybe he will stop the cruise ship immediately. 2. Dormer nodded. What? At this moment, a silver-gray crescent-shaped slash shot up from the bow of the cruise ship obliquely and rapidly into the sky, easily cutting off the mast in the middle of the cruise ship. Boom! The broken mast, together with the sail, fell to one side of the ship amidst a roar, and slammed hard on the side of the ship and on the sea. The cruise ship came to a quick stop amidst shaking. Well, look, I said this guy, let the cruise ship stop soon. Shitai Reese withdrew the surprise in his eyes, and turned to stare at Dormer, with an expression that he knew it would be like this. He then turned his head and glanced at the Liberty parked in front of the cruise ship, and quickly ordered to Dormer. Go, wait a minute, the warship is sailing far away. To understanding. Dormer gave a military salute, turned around quickly, and walked towards the middle deck. Shitai Reese withdrew his gaze, looked at the cruise ship, and tightened his left hand holding the scabbard. Even knowing Silverhair's character, he still felt a little nervous. Not nervous about his own life, but worried about these Marine soldiers on the two military ships following him. From Sorata's breath, he could sense an unparalleled anger and murderous intent. May you stick to your justice. He also hoped that Marine would be fine now, and let the silver hair do whatever else he wanted. Advertisement with such a great anger, he can't stop silver hair from killing someone. Having said that, a Marine actually wants to pray for a pirate to uphold his justice. It's really ironic, however, this is also impossible. Since 4 months ago, Naval Headquarters has known from top to bottom, whether it is Marine soldiers or high-level generals, that there is another group on the Grand Line. As long as Admiral is not leading the team, they will never be able to face the sea thief. He is a Vice Admiral. From the first sight of the iconic windmill flag of the Silver Hair Pirates, he knew the rules of action for this time. That is to wait and see what happens and do nothing. This will ensure their safety to the greatest extent possible. He is not a novice like Keto, he will not do things that seek death. With silver hair, they couldn't run away even if they wanted to. Because this guy can not only fly, but also teleport. You can catch up with them in a split second. This is the reason why their Marine is so emboldened in the face of the Silver Hair Pirates. Usually, with the maneuverability of the marine warships, on the Grand Line, as long as they don't meet opponents who are completely invincible like the Four Emperors, they basically run after the pirates. Moreover, ordinary pirates are completely incapable of fighting back when faced with the bombardment of warships. Now, just 2 words. Agreed. Shi Tyrese shook his head, not thinking so much anymore. Anyway, the silver hair is not for him to deal with. Even if he wants to arrest this guy, he can only shake his head and shout for the admirals from behind. He withdrew his thoughts and looked at the cruise ship with a hint of curiosity in his eyes. In fact, he had long been upset with the king of the Gamma Kingdom and his son, the little boy on the bow of the cruise ship. But who called him Marine? Accurate, I can only endure it. He can't do anything to the member countries of the world government. Even on their trip, they had to obey the orders of that B********** D king. And the reason for the silver-haired anger is definitely not the bombardment of that foolish prince, the little boy. For such a trivial matter, with a silver-haired demeanor, there is no need to show such a big anger. What could it be? Shi Tyrese kicked his feet on the deck, jumped into the sky, and then stepped on the air with both feet, and rushed towards the cruise ship with a whoosh. Go and have a look. Don't worry about it, Chapter 84 come here. No liberty. Stern. All the people on board stood here, looking at the cruise ship behind them. All of them were surprised. They had never felt so much anger at Sorata. Kuina stared at the cruise ship with indifference in her eyes. Although she didn't know why Sorata made such a killing intent, she knew that there must be something that made Sorata extremely angry, which caused Sorata to have such strong mood swings. This anger even affected the surrounding space, causing people to hallucinate. From here, we can know how angry Sorata is at this time. Seeing the cruise ship gradually come to a stop, she couldn't bear it anymore, put her feet on the deck, jumped into the sky, and rushed towards the cruise ship. Hey, don't be in such a hurry. Ahua looked at Kuina's back, pushed the frame, and muttered. Do you dare to put that in Kuina's face? Aluo turned his head and stared at Awa. Don't dare. Ahua replied confidently, cowardly and thoroughly, so cowardly that Aluo's words were swallowed up in his mouth, and he had nothing to say. You, seeing that Aluo was about to get angry, Adao quickly grabbed him. As long as there was no Kuina on board, the two guys could quarrel or even fight at any time. Okay, let's stop the boat quickly and go over to see what's going on. Okay, give Adao a face. Awa and Aluo looked at each other, putting away the fighting spirit in their eyes. They didn't fight for a day, and they were itchy all over. In order to fight, any excuse can be found. After a while, the Liberty stopped in front of the cruise ship. The people at the stern could already see a few figures standing on the bow of the cruise ship. Since the deck of the cruise ship is higher than that of the Liberty, they can only go up by jumping. Bang bang bang. This is the sound of the 3 of Awa falling to the ground. Puff. At this moment, a sound completely different from that of Awa and the 3 fell to the ground. Instantly attracted the attention of everyone on the bow of the cruise ship. Indigo, looking up, looked left and right. What's wrong? What are you looking at me for? Fine. Advertisement. Idao raised the cigarette in his hand and put it in his mouth, took a deep breath, then reached out and patted Indigo on the shoulder. It's okay, we're just attracted by your loud footsteps. Oh, Indigo nodded, then looked at Sorata. Captain, what's the matter, so angry? He glanced down at the little boy who had fainted at Sorata's feet, thought flashed in his eyes, and then shook his head. Based on what he knew about Sorata, it was obviously impossible for this little boy to make Sorata angry. It's nothing. Sorata looked at the little boy who fell on the ground, the murderous intent in his eyes slowly disappeared, then raised his head, his eyes swept over everyone. It's just that I saw some particularly disgusting things, and you will know later. After he finished speaking, he turned his head to look at Kuina, and when he saw the concerned look in Kuina's eyes, the corners of his mouth turned up and he pulled out an ugly smile. I'm fine. He knew it early on. I knew it from traveling through. Knowing that this world is not anime, as depicted in manga. This is a feudal world. A real and cruel world with countless slaves and countless tragedies. In this world, oppression, injustice, everywhere. When I watched anime and manga in my previous life, from the perspective of the protagonist group, I could only see the tip of the iceberg of this world. Moreover, most of the islands that the protagonist group passes through, and the civilians on the islands are all suffering from various oppressions. It's just that when I was watching anime and manga, I subconsciously ignored this point. I only saw the beauty of the protagonist group and the laughter of the rescued civilians afterwards, but I never thought about the countless behind the laughter. Unspeakable sadness. Sorata looked back at Kuina, reached out and patted the back of her hand on his arm. Signaled her to let him go. Then he turned around and walked towards the burly man who had been staring at him since he got on the boat, kneeling on the ground covered in bruises. At this moment, Shi Tyrese stepped on Moonwalk and rushed over quickly. Stop, Marine. Arlo turned his head to stare at Shi Tyrese, with his left hand up, wiping a handful of hair, holding the handle of the gun in his right hand, quickly drew out the gun, aiming the barrel at Shi Tyrese. Boom. 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 Looking at Arlo, Reese quickly stopped in the air. He felt a faint danger emanating from the barrel of the gun in Arlo's hand towards him, causing a sting on his forehead pointed by the barrel. Sigma, and 34, eh? Steve Reese stared at Arlo with surprise in his eyes. He remembered this guy named Laurentaro, and the reward seemed to be only 50 million berry. When did a pirate with 50 million berry actually make him, a vice admiral, feel dangerous? What have the silver-haired gang been doing these past few months? So much progress. Advertisement, Allo, let him come here. At this moment, Sorata's voice came from behind Arlo. It is good. Arlo's eyes glanced up and down on Tyrese. Then he touched his hair, turned his body sideways, and retracted the gun. Go over, Marine. Steve Reese withdrew his gaze from Arlo, raised his head and scanned the deck of the cruise ship. When he saw the little boy prince lying on the ground, he paused slightly, then kicked his feet in the air, rushed to the side of the ship, and landed on the upper deck. Come over. At this time, Sorata's voice sounded again. Huh, Tyrese withdrew his gaze, exhaled a breath, dispelled the tension in his heart, and looked up at Sorata. Looking at Sorata's not tall, but infinitely oppressive back, a trace of complexity flashed in his eyes. Such a person, how wonderful is Marine, pity. He sighed in his heart, raised his feet, and moved forward firmly. Of course he knew about the rumors that had spread across the ocean in the past few months. He felt that if he changed to a younger vice admiral, he might be so oppressed by this invisible oppression that he dared not move forward. If it weren't for him knowing the silver-haired character. Although no one spoke. Although he can't compete with elite vice admirals like flying squirrels and ghost spiders, he is still a vice admiral in the headquarters. The pirates he has caught can pile up into a hill. But there was an inexplicable aura that pressed on Tyrese, making his hairs stand up one by one. Such as, for Emperor's Regiment, this kind of tingling feeling all over his body, he only felt it on some completely invincible opponents. If it weren't for the cloak behind him, they're indeed pirates, not some undercover marine. If it weren't for him, he could barely be regarded as a veteran vice admiral. He looked away, walked past Kuina, and stared at Sorata's back. He was standing on the deck at this moment, facing all the members of the Silver Hair Pirates, as if a rabbit had entered a pride of lions. But he knew that it was impossible, even though Marine's top management knew that the silver-haired gang was completely different from ordinary pirates. They did not rob, harm civilians, or even Marine. It's too strong. When he saw the news for the first time, he was not without fantasy, as long as the news was true. Especially when he walked to Kuina's side and met Kuina's indifferent eyes, it made him feel the breath of death. All eyes are on Steel Reese. Chapter 85. Collar click. Click, click. The leather shoes stepped on the floor of the deck, making a slightly hollow sound. Finally, with a click, Steel Reese stopped beside Sorata. He is Marine, the justice behind him and the experience of these years supported him to come here, and supported him to stand beside Sorata, not behind him. With his strength, even in the face of an opponent who is completely invincible, he will not allow himself to retreat and be afraid. He looked at the strong man kneeling on the ground in front of him, his eyes stopped on the countless scars on the man's back, and a trace of sadness flashed in his eyes. Something. Marine. Powerless, although he, do not. It's Marine, who all hate that damn slavery. But that thing was made by the highest power in this world, the celestial dragons. Not to mention him, even the entire Marine can't do anything in this matter. Because the right of their Marine, the ultimate point, is from the celestial dragons. If there is no world government, Marine will never even want to exist. The unparalleled military expenditure can easily drag down any force. So, for the peace and stability of the world, even if Marine's top management, even the Marshal, hate the damn slave system, they sometimes have to turn a blind eye. Even sometimes when tragedy happens right in front of them, they have to selectively ignore it. Because the result of not ignoring is to judge Marine. Once separated from Marine, it is even more impossible for them to continue to uphold the justice in their hearts. Most people in this world are actually ordinary people, and of course Marine is no exception. They have no qualifications to grow into strong people. Therefore, if most people want to realize the justice in their hearts, they can only join Marine and rely on Marine's huge fleet, advanced warships and guns to maintain the peace of the sea. Tyrese withdrew his gaze, turned his head to look at Sorata, and asked seriously, Silver Hair, even if that foolish prince shoots at you, even if it's the slave in front of you, you don't need to be so angry. After being at sea for so long, he couldn't believe that Sorata hadn't seen anything darker than here in the bow. Besides, Sorata saved base a few months ago. You must know that Bath was destroyed. There should be more tragedies there, bigger. Not to mention that he didn't know, even the three of Ahua and Indigo didn't know why Sorata was so angry. It was Kuina who could vaguely feel the countless breaths of despair below the deck. Advertisement, although she felt it, seeing that Sorata didn't go down immediately, she held back the urgency in her heart and waited here. Just look at it. Sorata didn't turn his head to look at Steel Reese, his eyes were fixed on the strong man from the beginning to the end. And the strong man kept staring at Sorata. Know me? Without waiting for the strong man to answer, Sorata squatted down, looked at the iron chains on the strong man's limbs, and thought flashed in his eyes. He felt infinite light from the heart of this strong man. This is a person who is in the abyss and still believes in the light. I don't know what you're expecting. I don't know what you're waiting for. Sorata raised her head and stared at the strong man's eyes, the nebula flowed in the pupils, and a red light suddenly appeared, as if she wanted to see through the strong man's numb eyes and see the depths of his heart. Card, carry. At this moment, an intermittent hoarse sound came from the strong man's throat. The voice didn't sound like a normal person's, but it seemed to come from hell, full of gloom. It was only then that Sorata noticed that the strong man's tongue had long since disappeared, and his voice was forced out by rubbing his throat. Carrie, are you waiting for Carrie? Sorata looked into the strong man's eyes, a trace of sadness flashed in his eyes. The strong man nodded, the numbness in his eyes disappeared, and he stared at Sorata expectantly. Save. Save. Do not worry. Sorata reached out and interrupted the strong man's words. If you want to save Carrie, I'd better save you first. He wasn't sure if Carrie of the brawny mouth was on the ship, alive. Sorata lowered her head and looked at the iron chains on the limbs of the strong man. The iron chains were tied to the strong man's feet and hands, and were pulled between them. This is also the reason why the strong man always lies on the ground. He couldn't stand up. The burly man looked at Sorata with a flash of gratitude in his eyes. His only wish now was to see Carrie, and if it hadn't been for this wish to support him, he would have committed suicide long ago. He noticed Sorata the first time he showed up. He knew Sorata, had seen news of Sorata a few months ago when he was the watchman in his hometown. When his small town was reduced to slavery by the cruel king on the pretext of hiding a wanted criminal, he often thought of Sorata. He also hoped that someone would come to save Gam Island, save him, and save his daughter, Carrie, like he saved Bass. Advertisement. I don't know if it is the light that he has always longed for in his heart that has moved fate. Really, when he was about to completely despair, he met someone who could save him and his daughter. Sorata reached out, grabbed the iron chain, and gave it a firm grip. Kaka. In a sharp sound like grinding teeth, the iron chain was easily broken. Stand up. Sorata stood up, staring at the strong man standing up. Clang, quickly draw the knife. See. Everyone saw the flash of the knife, and the locks on the strong man's wrists and ankles snapped off. With a few bangs, the broken chain hit the deck. The strong man came back to his senses, moved his hands and feet, and a trace of excitement flashed across his face. Free at last. No one knows what it feels like to be treated like a dog, kneeling and crawling for more than a month. He knows. So he is sincerely excited about this moment, this hard-won freedom, but after the excitement comes deep worry. Since his wife died, his daughter has become his only relative in this world. He stopped his movements quickly, turned his head to stare at Sorata, and bent down. Sorata stared at the strong man and reached out to support him. Don't worry, as long as Carrie is on this boat, no one can hurt her at this moment. As he spoke, he looked at the strong man's neck and wanted to reach out to touch it, but the strong man backed away and avoided it. The strong man looked up at Sorata, touched the collar around his neck, and shook his head. Will. It will explode. At this time, Tyrese said next to Sorata. This is a slave collar specially designed by the nobles to prevent slaves from escaping, and they asked New World craftsmen to design it. He looked at the collar on the strong man's neck and said seriously, there is a small bomb in the collar. If it is squeezed with too much force, it will explode instantly, so it can only be opened with a key. The usual method can only be to ask for death, Road. The burly man looked at Sorata and nodded, that's all he wanted to say. Rest assured. Sorata stared into the strong man's eyes, trust me. Could he not know what was on the strong man's neck? Not to mention that he has mastered the emission, even if he has not mastered it, he can take it off. Chapter 86 Darkness. The strong man looked at Sorata, took a step forward, and raised his head without hesitation, revealing the collar on his neck. Sorata said no problem, then it will be possible, he sincerely believes in Sorata. Sorata stared at the burly man with a flash of admiration in her eyes. Then he looked down, staring at the collar on the strong man's neck, stretched out his hand, and grabbed the collar. A flow of flushed armament hockey instantly wrapped around his fist, and then from his fist outward, instantly wrapped the entire collar inside. Utilization of the highest level of armament hockey. Steel Reese stared at Sorata's hand with shock in his eyes. He knew that Sorata was very strong, but he didn't know how strong it was. His perception of Sorata is that Sorata is a peak swordsman who can fight the Golden Lion and Kazaru Admiral. What's more, it is a person with the ability of Space Fruit. I don't know about the others. The only people in Marine who have fought Sorata are Kazaru and Melisson. One of these two is Admiral, and the other is his predecessor, the elite veteran Vice Admiral and Vice Admiral. It is impossible for the two of them to share with him the specific process of fighting Sorata. So in Marine, apart from the two parties involved, only Marine Marshal Sengoku and Chief of Staff Suru are the only ones who know the specific strength of Sorata. 17 years old, armament hockey has made it this far. Tyrese looked up at Sorata's young face, and was amazed in his heart. It's really amazing. There is only one adjective he can think of to describe Sorata now. That is, monster. Sorata didn't know what was going on in the Marine Vice Admiral's mind beside him, and even if he knew, he wouldn't take it seriously. In this world full of miraculous powers, there are many monsters. For example, Juan Luffy, who will go to sea in 2 years, has gone from a small village in East Blue to the top of the world in just over 2 years. The real pinnacle, whether it is fame or combat power. So his achievements today are not worthy of his pride. His going to sea is smoother than Juan Luffy, and he is much stronger. And he still hangs. Facing Mihawk a few days ago, he understood that in this world, every peak existence cannot have obvious shortcomings. If it weren't for the invincible defense that comes with his space domain, without using his space ability, he might not be able to last even 1 day, let alone fight Mihawk for 2 days. So be the strongest in the world. Advertisement whether it is defense or attack. He still has a long way to go, at least his armament hockey, he can feel it, can still improve. Although observation hockey has awakened special abilities, they cannot be used in combat, so he needs to exercise. At least you have to exercise to the point where you can foresee the future briefly. However, he will not belittle himself. After all, he has just grown up, only 17 years old, and his body is still growing. He had a hunch. When he was 1 year older, his body would have to at least double his current size. At that time, whether it is strength, physical strength, or armament hockey, who is closely related to the body, he will be able to reach a peak. He believed that by then, he would truly be the strongest in the world. Okay, let's stop gossip. Sorata grabbed the collar around the strong man's neck and squeezed it hard. Click. He directly pinched the collar in his hand, then tore off the broken collar from the strong man's neck, and swung it to the right. Boom, I saw the collar flying towards Sorata's right, expanding rapidly as soon as it left Sorata's hand, and then exploded in a burst of sparks. Hearing the sound of the explosion, everyone turned their heads to stare at the sea covered in thick smoke in the distance. There was surprise in his eyes. They didn't expect the power of this thing to be so great. The power of the explosion is no less than that of a cannonball. Thinking of this thing being worn around the strong man's neck all the time, everyone looked at the strong man and couldn't help showing a touch of sympathy. Poor guy. It must be very uncomfortable to wear a collar. The strong man stood where he was, raised his hands, touched his neck, his fingers touched the strangle marks on his neck, and paused slightly. Then he covered his neck with his whole hand, feeling the temperature on his neck. It's really taken off. Really took off this slave collar that made him extremely humiliated. Thinking of this, he put down his hands, turned to look at Sorata, and bent down again. He couldn't say a complete sentence, and he could only use this kind of action to express his gratitude at this time. Advertisement. Sorata looked at the burly man, and finally showed his first smile after getting on the boat. This time he didn't reach out to help the strong man, but turned around and walked towards the center deck of the ship. Let's go and see together, the real hell on earth. Sorata looked at the door of the cabin behind the deck, the smile in his eyes disappeared instantly, and he was indifferent. On the deck of the cruise ship, there are no buildings with several floors like ordinary cruise ships. There is only a cabin at the stern. Instead, it's under the deck of the cruise ship. Boom boom boom. Everyone followed Sorata, walked into the cabin, and walked down the spacious stairs. Ignoring the two guards who were fainted on the ground, both sides of the gate were covered with smoke. Boom, Sorata kicked the door open. Inside the gate is an aisle, and the floor of the aisle and the walls on both sides are decorated magnificently. Sorata suppressed the murderous thoughts in her heart, stood in front of a door, stopped, turned her head to look at Kuina, and patted his head. Kuina didn't listen to Sorata's words. She still held Sorata's hand, didn't let go, and held it even tighter. He stared up at Sorata's profile with concern in his eyes. Fine. Even the door handles of the rooms on both sides are made of golden yellow pure gold. Then he turned his head, looked at the door in front of him, stretched out his hand, touched the golden doorknob with his palm, and paused. Sorata takes the lead and moves on. Sorata withdrew her hand, looked at Kuina, met her firm eyes, and paused slightly. Everyone hurriedly followed. As Sorata moved forward, a faint murderous intent shot out from Jonan's body again and again. He actually didn't want Kuina to touch the dark ones. Full of luxury. Then without hesitation, he twisted down, pushed forward, and opened the door. Behind Sorata, Kuina sensed Sorata's murderous intent, stepped forward quickly, and grabbed Sorata's hand. But when I think that I may encounter such a scene in the future, I will let Kuina get in touch sooner or later. It is better to let her know how cruel the real world is in the morning. In the aisle inside the gate, there were also two guards lying down, with the same white eyes. However, unlike the two guards outside, the guards inside were obviously more refined, and of course, just like the surrounding environment, they also revealed luxury. Chapter 87. The dazzling blood-red plum blossom mark. Into the room. When you see what's in the room, everyone's eyes were full of astonishment and anger. They also finally understood why Sorata was so angry. The scene in front of me, needless to say, is Sorata. Even any normal person will be angry when seeing such a scene. I saw a girl covered in kai and scars in the room being tied to a chair with her legs spread apart. The air was filled with an inexplicable smell and bloody smell. In front of the girl, there was a plump, middle-aged ugly man in gorgeous costumes and a crown. He was upright, his lower body was bent, his buttocks were pouted, and he knelt down on the ground with his head lying on the ground and his eyes were white. And beside the man's hand, a golden scepter rolled down. The front end of the scepter revealed blood red in the golden color. There were more men lying on the ground around them, and inside of these men lay a few young girls who had died long ago. These girls all have one characteristic in common. They are all covered with injuries, and all of them have their eyes open. The hatred and despair revealed in those eyes did not dissipate completely until death, until Sorata and the others came in. Even more infuriating is a wall in the room. A woman is tied up on a big turntable. The woman lowered her head, her long hair hung loose in front of her body, and she couldn't see her specific face, while his body was full of throwing knives and darts. Blood dripped all over the ground along the woman's skin, along the throwing knife, and along the dart. Besides Sorata, Kuina trembled uncontrollably. She stared at the scene in front of her in disbelief. Can people really be so evil? She shook her head, holding the scabbard with He Dao Yuan in her left hand, and lifted it upwards. Killing intent surged all over his body. These guys can no longer be called human beings, but beasts and devils. Not urgent. Sensing Kuina's killing intent, Sorata held Kuina's hand backhanded, glanced at her, then turned to stare at the man on the ground with his asterisk pouting and wearing a crown, and said indifferently, "It's too cheap to kill these bastards so easily. They're gone." As he spoke, he looked up at the girl on the turntable, Dr. Indigo. "Okay. Go and see these poor girls." He paused slightly and then said, "See if they can still be saved?" At this time, there are two girls with aura in the room. One is the one on the chair, and the other is the one on the big turntable. In fact, Indigo didn't need to look at it, he already knew the result. In his induction, the two girls were actually exhausted, and they didn't die immediately because their fire of life had not been extinguished, and their willpower was also added. But, advertisement also soon. That's why he was feeling it, but didn't come down immediately. It's useless for him to come down, he should take Indigo with him, maybe Indigo can save these two girls? Indigo met Sorata's eyes and hurried forward. Walking to the chair, looking at the bruised girl, Indigo's eyes flashed with pity. He gently took the girl's hand, touched her wrist, and sensed it. At this moment, the girl suddenly opened her eyes. He stared at Indigo, his eyeballs were bloodshot, and there was a shocking hatred in his eyes. "Do not move." Indigo stared into the girl's eyes and said softly, "I'm not from the ship, I'm a doctor." "Doctors? Okay." Indigo nodded, paused for a moment with the hand pinching the girl's wrist, then looked up at Sorata and shook his head. He let go of the girl, stood up, and walked towards the big turntable. Obviously, the girl cannot be saved. Although he knew the result a long time ago, looking at the girl, Sorata still had a flash of unbearable eyes. He let go of Kuina, walked to the girl, took off the moon-white robe, and gently covered the girl, covering her bruised body inside. As soon as it was covered, the blood quickly stained the robe red. On the moon-white robe, the blood-red marks like plum blossoms are so dazzling under the light. Sorata crouched down, staring into the girl's eyes. "Sorry, we can't save you." The girl stared at Sorata with her head tilted, her eyes rolled. You, who are you?" "Us?" Sorata paused, staring at the girl, with the corners of her mouth upturned, showing a gentle smile. "We're partners of justice." "Justice?" The girl stared at Sorata, with a hint of sarcasm flashing in her eyes. "What is that thing? Can it be eaten? Can it bring us back to normal?" As soon as she spoke, she raised her arm and grabbed Sorata's hand, holding it tightly, and the nails were firmly pierced into the skin on the back of Sorata's hand. Then his body was like a flash of light, his back left the chair, he straightened his chest, leaned forward, stared at Sorata and shouted loudly, "Stop joking, there is no such thing as justice in this world." Boom! After she finished speaking, she lost all her strength, fell backwards, and then fell back on the chair. And she held Sorata's hand, and it also slackened, and slowly slipped from Sorata's hand, and finally hung on the side of the chair, unable to lift it up again. Sorata stared at the girl, ignoring the girl's actions and words just now. He raised his hand and rubbed the girl's head. "Although this world may be rotten, there is no shortage of people who truly want to be bright. I know you are in pain, and even after going through hardships, you are completely hostile to this world, but Advertisement. As he spoke, his hand went down, under the girl's chin and up, supporting the girl's chin, helping her to lift her head and let her look forward. "Everyone is going to die anyway, don't worry, I will let him come down to meet you soon, and when you get down there, you have to treat him well." The girl looked at the figure lying in front of her that made her extremely fearful, loathed, and disgusted. Her eyes revealed monstrous hatred, and then infinite pleasure flashed through her eyes. "Ha ha 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 ha." She watched and laughed. Cough cough cough. Blood gushed from the corner of his mouth, his laughter stopped, and he lost his breath completely. Sorata stood up, stared at the girl, stared at the girl's eyes that she refused to close, stared at the last trace of madness and smile in the girl's eyes, and sighed inwardly. At least, when she died, she still had a smile on her face. Although this kind of smile is full of madness, it is also a smile, isn't it? Beside the door, a Dao leaned against the door, swallowing a cloud. He withdrew his gaze into the room, turned his head to stare at Reese, who was on the opposite side, and taunted. "This is the justice of your marine, it's really an eye-opener." Steel Reese was speechless. Looking at the scene in the house, his face was calm, but his heart was full of irritability. He withdrew his gaze, lowered his head, took out a box of cigars from his trouser pocket, opened the box, took out one, then cut a knife at the end of the cigar under the blade that came with the cigar box, cut the cigar open, and put it in his mouth. He put the cigar box back into his trouser pocket, then groped inside, paused, then raised his head and looked at Adao. "Can I borrow a fire?" He came out in such a hurry that he forgot to bring a fire. In fact, he seldom smokes, but seeing the scene inside the house, he can only release his irritability through smoking. Adao stared at Shitai Reese for a while, then held a cigarette in his mouth, took out the lighter from his trouser pocket with his right hand, and threw it to Shitai Reese. "For the sake of fellow smokers, I lent it to you, let's go." Snapped. Shitai Reese took the lighter thrown by Adao, and pried open the cap of the lighter with his right thumb. Ding, then press the scroll wheel with your thumb and slide it down. Crack. The flames rose up. Shitai Reese looked at the flames in front of him, his eyes flickered, then he lowered his head, put the cigar in his mouth to the flames, blinked his mouth, and took a few puffs. Hiss. As sparks flickered, smoke rose. Thanks. He raised his head, looked at Adao, shook the flame on the fire extinguisher, closed the lid, and threw it back to Adao. Adao took the lighter and casually put it in his trouser pocket, ignoring Shi Tyrese. Chapter 88. This damn fate in front of the big turntable. Indigo used the same method to determine the physical condition of the girl. He put down the girl's hand, turned to look at Sorata behind him, shook his head, and a trace of sadness flashed in his eyes. He is not a god, and he is indeed powerless to deal with these two girls whose bodies have been severely damaged. It can be said that they are exhausted. Fine. Sorata patted Indigo on the shoulder, walked past him, and stood in front of the big turntable. He quietly looked at the weakly breathing girl in front of him, and said softly, "Girl, do you have any other wishes? Tell me, maybe I can help you realize it." This girl is the only one in the room who's wearing clothes. Although her body was tied to the big turntable, although her body was covered with bruises, but she didn't make a sound. Sorata knew that she was still alive and awake at this time, but he couldn't let her go, because considering the girl's physical condition, as long as she let go, she might die immediately. Hearing Sorata's gentle voice, the girl raised her head, her bloodshot eyes were hazy. Then gradually regained clarity. There was no hatred like other girls in her eyes, not even pain. Her eyes calmly swept around the room, and when they glanced at the man kneeling on the ground wearing a crown, there was a hint of pleasure in her eyes. Then she quickly moved away, and finally landed on Sorata's face. She stared at Sorata's eyes, blankly at first, then suddenly brightened. She licked her chapped lips and opened her throat hoarsely. "Silver-haired Sorata? Okay." Sorata nodded. "You know me?" "No." The girl stared at Sorata, her eyes fluctuated. "Can you please save my father?" "Father?" Sorata stared at the girl, paused for a moment, then tore off the wine gourd on his waist, and raised his head. "Gugu. Gugu. What the hell is this?" At this moment, even with his firm heart, he couldn't help but moisten his eyes. In anticipation of meeting his only daughter again, the father endures a life of slavery like a dog. The daughter endured physical devastation and mental pain, and refused to swallow her last breath. When she saw someone who could save her, the first thing she said was to ask him to save her father. Sorata didn't know what mood he should use to face the strong man outside the door. Putting down the wine gourd, Sorata lowered his head, met the girl's expectant eyes, turned around, and walked out. "Come in." He didn't let the strong man in at first, because he was afraid that there would be his daughter in the room. But, this damned fate, outside the door. The strong man stared at the half-open door and rubbed his hands, looking extremely nervous. Hearing Sorata's voice, he hurried forward, but he hesitated when he stepped through the door. He was afraid of entering this door and seeing the scene he least wanted to see. But no matter how afraid he is, he will go in. Advertisement. Without hesitating for a long time, he stared at the door, raised his foot firmly, and walked in. The moment he entered, he saw the scene in the room clearly. When he saw the girl on the chair and on the ground, his pupils shrank, and he stopped in place in shock. Although I didn't see the characteristics of a daughter in these girls, but this hell-like scene still made his heart tremble. Just then, a shadow blocked his vision. Sorata looked at the strong man with a look of unbearable eyes, but she stepped aside and patted the strong man on the shoulder. Walked past him and out of the room. Everyone, following Sorata, walked out of the room one after another. The last Dao glanced at the strong man and closed the door. In the aisle, everyone stood peacefully, only Sorata was leaning against the wall, drinking with her head up. Gugu. The sound of the wine sliding down the throat was extremely harsh in this quiet and oppressive corridor. At this moment, there was an extremely painful roar from the room, which made Sorata's movements involuntarily pause. This damn world is really dark enough. He wants laughter too. He also wants to have a carefree adventure. He wants to appreciate all kinds of beautiful scenery in this world. But, counting the islands he has been to since he went to sea, there are no tragedies that have not happened or are happening. When we arrived at the Grand Line, we met one after another. This is what he met, and more tragedies are happening where he can't see. He just wants to have a good adventure and play. Why did he meet all these disgusting things? How is he going to save the world? But he knows his abilities. Is saving the world something that only strength can do? If that's the case, that's fine. It was the sum of various factors. If you want to save the world, you must not only liberate people, but also liberate people's minds. He is not a saint. He was an ordinary person in his previous life, and in this life, he is an ordinary person with stronger strength. But there is no such great idea that can save the world. Sorata put down the wine gourd, leaned her head against the wall, and looked up at the hot lights overhead. All these tragedies are the damn slave system. If there is no slave system, the tragedy of this world will be at least half less. Slavery. Sorata raised the wine gourd, opened her mouth, and took a sip. Stand up straight, turn around, and walk towards the innermost door in the corridor. Let's go. He can't save the world, but he can abolish the damn slavery. As long as his strength can be truly invincible, he believes that it doesn't matter if it's the celestial dragons or the revolutionary army that will overthrow the world government in the future. The system established by him will be strictly followed. So, at this moment, he has set another goal since he went to sea. Advertisement that is to be the strongest in the real world, and then kill all the disgusting celestial dragons. For him, who lived in a peaceful era in his previous life and lived in a safe and worry-free Yixin dojo in this life, this thing disgusted him so much. So he must abolish that damn slavery. The root of slavery lies in celestial dragons and nobles. The celestial dragons may be delivered to him, noble. It can only be handed over to the revolutionary army. Who told them to do this? ... Squeak. Sorata pushed open the door in front of her and walked in. This room is completely different from the room just now. The room is dark and damp, with only a light on the roof emitting a faint light. There is nothing else in the room, only 2 rows of iron cages. The iron cage was divided into narrow iron cages that could only accommodate 1 person. Some of the cages were empty, while many more held people in rags and chains. There are men and women in the cage, the men are all young and middle-aged, and the women are all girls. Apparently, this is where the ship held the slaves. When the slaves heard the sound of the door opening and the sound of footsteps, they all moved, their eyes were dark and numb. The guards are here to catch one of them again. Let's have fun with that B********* D king. Imprisoned here, they already understood their fate. They don't expect to leave here alive, they only expect to suffer less torture. At this time, bang, the sound of chains falling caught their attention. They raised their heads, staring at the strange figures outside the chains, and at the cage door that had been opened at some point. The slaves looked up and stared at Sorata with disbelief on their faces. Only then did the slaves come to their senses. They waited for a while and saw that no one came in. Then their eyes flickered and they walked out of the cage cautiously. Their eyes suddenly changed. Really free? As he walked, he said, freedom is given to you. All the guards on the boat have fainted. You can take revenge for your grievances. No one can stop you. Until Sorata and several others left, endlessly. With that said, he walked out of the room. Okay. There was a ripple in his eyes. Sorata nodded, glanced at the various instruments of torture on the surrounding walls, turned around, and walked out of the room. There was a scream. They first found the key, opened the iron chains on their hands and feet, then took the torture equipment from the wall, and walked slowly to the guard. Free. Then, when he looked through the door and saw the 2 guards who really fainted outside the door. Come out. You are free. Become blood red, become fierce. Chapter 89 The Call with Sengoku, the bow of the cruise ship. Sorata and others have been waiting here for more than 2 hours. The screams from below stopped. After such a long time, their emotions have recovered. Sorata turned to look at Indigo and said, Dr. Indigo, go prepare some medicine, those slaves. Having said that, he paused slightly and then said, although the wounds on those people's bodies are not fatal, it is better to deal with them. If they get infected, it will be bad. Understood, Captain. Puff, puff, Indigo replied, turned around and took a step forward, jumping from the bow of the cruise ship onto the Liberty. Go to the infirmary below. Sorata then turned to look at Awa. Awa, let's make some food. It is good. Awa pushed down the mirror frame and jumped off the bow. It may take a long time for him to cook for so many people alone. There are many cooks on our ship, so let me do it. At this moment, Shitai Reese spoke. Okay, Sorata nodded and turned to stare at Steel Reese. Only then did he take a good look at Shitai Reese, and found that this guy, whoever, abolished 7 warlords of the sea, and led the team to capture the name must not be written backwards, nor can it be read backwards, Pirate the Lucky King of the World, the Buggy God tier, the Vice Admiral? Before he crossed over, in the latest episode of comics he saw, that guy Buggy seemed to be 4 emperors. It's outrageous. He shook his head and looked at Steve Reese with a strange look in his eyes. This is the guy who pushed Buggy to the throne of the 4 emperors. NB. What's wrong? Steel Reese was uncomfortable being stared at by Sorata. Fine. Sorata waved his hands, put away the weirdness in his eyes, turned around, stared at the direction of the sea, and raised the wine gourd. Gudu, huh, he put down the wine gourd, let out a breath of alcohol, and said calmly, Marine, what's your name? Steel Reese. Steel Reese, right? I can let you off today. Steel Reese looked up, stared at Sorata, and breathed a sigh of relief. Although from the beginning, Sorata had no intention of killing him, he had already expected such an ending. But at this time, from Sorata, he was relieved to hear that he would really let them go. Marine is not afraid of sacrifice, but fearless sacrifice. And if you can live, who wants to die? He said to Sorata, is there any condition? It's not a condition. Advertisement. Sorata turned her head and stared into Shitai Reese's eyes, the corners of her mouth were turned up, and a smile flashed in her eyes. Can I trouble you to take down the phone bug on your warship? Phone bug? Shitai Reese asked suspiciously, why do you want a phone bug? Take it and you'll know. Sorata waved his hands, turned his head, and raised the wine gourd to the sea again. Steve Reese, looking at Sorata, hesitated for a moment. Then jumped up, stepped on the moonwalk, and rushed towards the military aircraft next to the cruise ship. He didn't understand why Sorata wanted the phone bug. But he can only do so at this time. After all, the situation is stronger than people. After a while, Steve Reese took the phone bug, stepped on the moonwalk, and returned to the bow of the cruise ship. No, take it. As he spoke, he handed the phone bug to Sorata. Sorata didn't reach for it, but turned around and leaned her back against the railing of the bow. He raised his head and took a sip of wine. He lowered his head and stared at Shitai Reese. What are you doing to me? Dial the number. Dial. A question mark flashed in Shitai Reese's mind. He raised his head and asked Sorata, what number are you dialing? What number? Of course it's your naval headquarters, Admiral Sengoku's number. As he spoke, he tilted his head and stared at Steve Reese with a strange look in his eyes. Otherwise, why would I need your phone bug? He has a few things to tell Sengoku well. Otherwise, it would be a bit annoying to meet Marine who came to harass him every time. In fact, the last time first met that Marine named Kido on Magnetic Drum Island, he wanted to call Sengoku. But when he went to see Chopper later, he put the matter behind him. Oh, Shitai Reese withdrew his hand and didn't ask anything else. He quickly dialed the number of the headquarters, and then picked up the receiver amidst a burst of brubulu. Moses, I'm Steel Reese. If you need anything, please contact Mr. Sengoku. Naval Headquarters, Communications Department. A communicator picked up the microphone on the huge phone bug in front of him, and said to the microphone, it's Steve Reese, Vice Admiral. Mr. Sengoku is in the office now, I'll transfer it to you. As he spoke, he put the microphone aside, took a small phone bug on the side, and dialed it. After a while the call was made. He quickly picked up the microphone and said into the microphone, report to Marshal Sengoku. This is the Department of Communications. Shitai Reese, Vice Admiral, called, saying something important. Okay. The phone bug nodded. The correspondent quickly connected the two phone bugs together, and let the phone bug in Reese's hand be sent directly to Sengoku's office. Why not call Sengoku's office directly? Because there is a distance between the signal transmission and reception of the phone bug. At this time, Shitai Reese's warship is too far away from the headquarters, and the signal can only be received through a large phone bug. Advertisement. Therefore, when Marine is performing a mission to contact Naval Headquarters, he usually calls the Communications Department, and then asks the Communications Department to make a transfer to connect to other phone bugs. In the Marshal's office, Sengoku sat at his desk. Looking at the pile of documents in front of him, these documents are the reports that Marine has received from the kings of various countries in the past few days. He pushed the report aside, stretched, and leaned his back on the chair behind him. The whole person suddenly became lazy. At this moment, he is alone in the office, so it's okay to relax a little bit. He took the microphone on the right side of the table, and said into the microphone, is this Steel Reese? I'm Sengoku, what's the matter? He remembered that Steel Reese was going to pick up the King of Gamma Kingdom. Due to the distance, it should be near Alabasta, the Desert Kingdom. Alabasta? His hand holding the microphone froze and his eyes lit up. The Silver Hair Pirates are right there. Could it be that I met the Silver Hair Pirates? Thinking of this, he quickly sat up straight, with a serious look on his face. He looked at the phone bug and waited for a while, but he didn't wait for Steve Reese's voice. Just when he was about to speak, the head of the phone bug in front of him suddenly changed its appearance. Looking at the phone bug's head, Sengoku's heart twitched. Sure enough, I really met Silver Hair. Sengoku, I think you should know who I am. The phone bug rolled his eyes and stared at Sengoku. Silver Hair. Sengoku pushed up the frame of the mirror and stared into the phone bug's eyes, his face serious. Is there a problem? At the bow of the cruise ship, Sorata held the microphone in his right hand, and took a sip with his left hand holding up the wine gourd, then lowered his head, exhaled alcohol into the microphone, and said, I have two things to do with Mr. Sengoku this time. Say. Sorata put away the smile in her eyes, stared at the eyes of the phone bug. A trace of indifference flashed in her eyes. The first thing is, I hope you Marines will restrain the Marines below, and you will shoot me for no reason in the future. I will not let them go. In the Marshal's office, Sengoku put the microphone on the table, propped his chin with his hands, stared into the eyes of the phone bug, and did not answer. He knew that Sorata was talking about Drum Island. Marine is so big, there are always some young and impulsive Marines, he can't manage every Marine. So he can only ignore Sorata's first thing. As for the future, he can only try his best to keep those young Marines from messing with Silver Hair. This is not a cowardice, this is wisely saving Marine to make a senseless and fearless sacrifice. Sengoku didn't answer, and Sorata didn't force it either. He just stated his plan. As for whether Marine will shoot him in the future, that is Marine's business. But if he fires the cannon, whether he kills Marine or not is his business. What about the second thing? The second thing is that first hope that Marine will stop escorting those disgusting nobles. This time I will let go of the two Marines that came to escort this time. Next time. Sorata didn't go on. He believed that Sengoku should feel his killing intent. This time he was indeed furious like never before, and at one point he planned to destroy Marine to vent his anger. But he suppressed his anger in the end and didn't bother Marine. He is not a murderous monster. He can kill those pirates who do all kinds of evil without hesitation, but he really can't kill these Marines. Chapter 90. This guy is getting more and more stinky and arrogant. Naval Headquarters. Marshal's office. Sengoku stared at the phone bug that had hung up in front of him, in a daze for a long time. When he came back to his senses, he stretched out his hand, picked up the receiver, and put it back on the bug's back. The corners of his mouth turned up, and a smile appeared on his face. This brat. Although he could feel Sorata's killing intent, he felt more of kindness. That silver-haired brat is indeed a man of justice. Pity. He shook his head and sighed. His pity is that Sorata is not a real Marine, but a pirate. Although he doesn't hate this pirate, But, he leaned back and looked up at the roof, as if through the roof, he saw the Holy Land, the 5 elders, and the celestial dragons. Except for Marine, this guy is very hostile to the world government. Never mind. Sengoku looked away, shook his head, sat up straight, looked at the pile of documents in front of him, and sighed. He has a lot to do. Since he became admiral and marshal, he hasn't gone on vacation for a long time, and hasn't completely relaxed for a long time. He often wonders what it would be like if he refused to be admiral like Garp did. You will definitely live a more free and nourishing life. But he's not Garp, and that's just a thought. I believe that if he is allowed to choose again, he will still be admiral and marshal. After all, his concept of justice is justice in the world. To be the king of the world, of course you must be the highest position in Marine, so that you can implement his concept of justice. Shaking his head again, he didn't think so much anymore. Sengoku reached for the documents and read one by one. The room was back to normal, quiet and peaceful. There is only the friction of paper being flipped and the sound of sheep chewing paper. ... Cruise ship bow. Sorata hung the microphone back on the back of the phone bug that Steel Reese was holding in both hands. Leaning back against the railing, he raised his head and took a sip of wine. Then he lowered his head, stared at Shitai Reese and said, "Okay, you can go back, and you can leave after the cooking is done." Shitai Reese glanced at Sorata, said nothing, turned around, stepped on the moonwalk, and headed for the warship. Advertisement. Although the mission of this trip failed, he was not disappointed at all in his heart, but instead had a hint of joy. If it turned out that he was only disgusted with the king and prince of the Gamma Kingdom, then after seeing everything in the room below the deck, he was disgusted. It is the best ending for him that this kind of beast can be dealt with by the silver-haired gang. Thinking of this, he couldn't help shaking his head, a sneer flashed in his eyes. For Marine, who regards himself as righteous, it is really ironic to rely on pirates to achieve true justice and rely on pirates to punish evil. Warship, shipside. The deputy colonel was relieved to see Steve Reese back. He looked at Steel Reese and asked, "Steel Reese, Vice Admiral, what shall we do next?" Steve Reese did not answer the colonel's question, walked slowly to the colonel's side, and then walked past him. "Is the meal ready?" The colonel turned around, followed behind Steel Reese, stared at Steel Reese back, and said, "Everything is ready. When you're ready, send it down." "Oh," the colonel replied, and then asked, "Then what's next?" "Next." Steve Reese paused, then moved forward, walked to the mast in the middle of the deck, opened the door on the mast, and put the phone bug in. Then he turned around and looked at the colonel. "Of course the next step is to sail back to naval headquarters." "Oh." The colonel nodded, then, as if thinking of something, he raised his head and stared at Steve Reese. "What about our mission this time?" He didn't know what happened on the cruise ship, and he was still thinking about the mission. Steve Reese leaned back, leaning his back on the mast, slowly relaxed his body, slid slowly along the mast, and finally sat on the deck. When he was on the cruise ship, although he knew that Sorata would not kill him, but the ubiquitous fatal crisis was always on him, so that he did not dare to relax at all. Once back on the warship, he could no longer bear the mental exhaustion and relaxed. "Master Vice Admiral." The colonel looked at Shitai Reese, and quickly asked, "Are you all right?" "Fine." Shitai Reese waved his hand, not intending to say more. He took out a cigarette, put it in his mouth, looked up at the colonel, and said with a smile, "Please, borrow a fire. I didn't bring a fire." "Oh." The colonel quickly took out the lighter, bent down, and stretched the pulley with his right hand forward. "Wipe, flames rise." Shitai Reese looked at the flames in front of him, stretched out his left hand to protect the fire, and sucked in his mouth. Hee, sparks flickered, and a little smoke floated up. Seeing that the cigarette was lit, Shitai Reese let go of his hand, leaned his head back, resting his head on the mast, looked up at the clouds drifting by in the sky. His eyes were full of thoughts. To be honest, if he wasn't a veteran vice admiral, after seeing the scene in the cruise ship, I'm afraid he couldn't help but betray a Marine. Advertisement. Having been a Marine for decades, he has heard of darker things than this, but he has never seen it with his own eyes. This incident can be said to be the darkest, ugliest, and most disgusting thing he has ever seen in his life. Withdrawing his thoughts, he turned his head and looked at the colonel standing beside him, looking at him with concern. Shitai Reese waved to him, "Hurry up and send the food to the silver-haired group on the cruise ship." After delivering the food, he paused slightly, lowered his head, took a puff of cigarette resentfully, opened his mouth, and let the shreds of tobacco float out naturally along the corners of his mouth. "After delivery, let's set sail. As for the mission, our mission has failed this time, and Mr. Sengoku already knows." "Oh, not yet." Shitai Reese looked up at the colonel who was still standing beside him, and he emphasized his tone. "To understanding." The colonel stood beside him, gave a military salute, and turned to the kitchen. After a while, he walked to the side of the boat with 2 rows of Marine and several barrels of food. The bucket was tied to a rope and lowered over the side of the boat. At the bow of the cruise ship, a Luo and a Dao stood up quickly, walked to the side of the ship, and took over the bucket that fell from above. Boom, the iron drum fell on the deck with a dull sound. "It's quite heavy, quite a lot." Arlo untied the rope, looked up at Marine above, and shouted, "Thank you." Marine on the side of the boat subconsciously shouted to the bottom, "You're welcome." After remembering that the ones below were pirates, they paused in unison, then quickly pulled up the rope and left the side of the boat. These Marines are quite polite. A Dao and a Luo looked back, looked at each other, lifted the barrel, walked down the bow, and put the barrel on the middle deck. Looking at the marine warships setting sail on both sides, a smile flashed in his eyes. Of course it's polite. Arlo put down the barrel, straightened his waist, and reached out to touch his hairstyle. I don't even look at who Marine is up against. Who? Adele blinked her mouth, took a deep breath of the cigarette in her mouth, raised her head, and blew a smoke ring towards the sky, then glanced at Aluo contemptuously. Who is it? Needless to say, after speaking, he raised his head, strolled past Arlo, and walked towards the bow. His back was like an elegant cat. You. Aruo paused with his hand touching his head, looked down at Adao's back, and the corners of his mouth twitched. This guy is getting more and more stinky and arrogant. Thinking of Adao's fruit, the corners of his mouth turned up, showing a smile. It's normal to be proud after eating that kind of fruit. Ha ha. Chapter 91. It's okay to give it to them 2 hours later. The marine warship has long since disappeared. At this time, in this sea area, only Liberty and the cruise ship are left. On the middle deck of the cruise ship, Boom, 40 strong men and 20 girls, led by Carl, knelt down to Sorata, who was standing on the bow of the cruise ship. Thanks. Carl is the strong man that Sorata rescued at the bow at the beginning, and also the father of the girl Carrie on the big turntable. Sorata turned her head and looked down, looking at Carl with a smile in her eyes. He shouted to the people below, "Get up, I don't like bowing down here." As he spoke, he looked at Carl. He didn't expect that Carl's daughter was actually the leader of most of the people here. Carl's village was destroyed because of the revenge of the king of Gamma Kingdom because of protecting his daughter. And his daughter, Carrie, is actually one of the leaders of the Gamma Kingdom's rebel army. It is not difficult to understand why Carrie has such a strong willpower. After Carrie died, Carl successfully became the leader of this group of people. They have decided to quickly return to the Gamma Kingdom to fight for their compatriots. I believe that there are the heads of the king and prince of the Gamma Kingdom, and they will definitely be able to liberate Gamma Island this time. Carl, get up. I just did what I thought I should do, but I didn't do anything. You did it all yourself. Also, you have to go back and liberate your country. Saying so, Sorata raised her head and took a sip of her wine, then looked down. Get up, I have received your thanks. Let's part here, okay. Carl quickly raised his head and looked towards the bow of the ship, but there was still Sorata there. He quickly stood up, walked quickly to the bow with the people behind him, looked at the Liberty in front of which the sails were raised, opened his mouth and shouted loudly. "Oh, see you again, see you again." As he spoke, he raised his hand and shook it at the Liberty. And the people behind him also raised their hands after him and shouted loudly to the front, "Goodbye." The Liberty turned around and slid past the cruise ship obliquely in front. Their direction this time is Alabasta, which is about 100 degrees from Gamma Island where the cruise ship is going. It can be said that they are completely opposite directions. The stern of the Liberty. Sorata leaned his back on the stern guardrail, and Kuina stood beside him, facing the direction of the cruise ship, feeling the gratitude of everyone on the bow of the cruise ship, the corners of his mouth raised, showing a gentle smile. He tilted his head to look at Sorata's profile, and said with a smile, "Aren't you going to say something?" Huh, advertisement. Sorata put down the wine gourd, let out a breath of alcohol, turned to look at Kuina, and rubbed her head with her hand. The parting of a man does not require any words, as long as he silently wishes in his heart. I believe that Carl and the others will be able to do it and truly liberate Gamma Island. Kuina narrowed her eyes slightly, and let out a sound from her nose. I don't know whether it's because of comfort, or because I really heard Sorata's words and made the answer. At the bow of the cruise ship, Carl looked at the sea in front of him until the Liberty completely disappeared below the sea level, then he looked back and turned to stare at the dozens of people behind him. He straightened his waist, held his head high, and his eyes were full of fighting spirit. Although he has no tongue, although he is not strong. But he inherited his daughter Carrie's last wish. He must completely liberate Gamma, and make Gamma Island and Gamma Kingdom a truly peaceful country. He wants to completely overthrow the king's family. Do not, it is to completely kill the king's family. Because this family is full of cruel beasts like the king and the little prince. For such a person, he will not have the slightest pity. He raised his hand and shouted loudly, "Back." The voice was hoarse, but full of momentum, resounding through the entire sea area. Everyone looked at Carl with excitement in their eyes. This is the new king they have chosen. A king who truly has the air of a king and the face of a king. They raised their hands at the same time, raised their heads and roared, "Way, liberate Gamma, liberate Gamma." Then put down his hands neatly, turned around, and walked down the bow. After a while, the sails of the cruise ship were hung up. On the largest mast in the middle of the cruise ship, a circle of iron sheets can be clearly seen surrounding the mast. The mast of the cruise ship was cut off by Sorata, but it was repaired by Sorata and Adao later. Otherwise, this cruise ship will not be able to return to Gamma. On the bow of the cruise ship, Carl stood by the guardrail, his body straightened, facing the seawind, staring in Gamma's direction with firm eyes. "Wait for me. Gamma." At this moment, he seemed to be a real king, full of unprecedented momentum and tenacity. Just as Sorata and the others were heading towards Alabasta. Alabasta. Rainy Land. Bar Lock's real home base. Casino, Rain Feast. Advertisement boss office. A swivel chair with its back facing the door. A man with a posy back, a long horizontal scar on his face, an earring on his right ear, an orange plaid long-sleeved shirt inside, and a black fur coat outside, is smoking a cigar and leaning back on a chair. Go, look at the newspaper in your hand. He took a puff of the cigarette, swirled the cigarette in his mouth, and then let the shreds of tobacco float away from the corner of his mouth. Looking at the contents of the newspaper, he laughed out loud. Goo ha 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 ha. The eagle-eyed guy really waited for the silver-haired guy for several months near Magnetic Drum Island. As he spoke, he put down the newspaper and kicked his feet on the ground. Rotate the chair and face the direction of the desk. Then he put down the newspaper and turned to look at the sofa on the right. On the sofa, there was a short-haired woman wearing a purple cowboy hat with a white edge, a purple miniskirt, and a white fur coat. The woman had blue and black pupils and wheat-colored skin. She is a beautiful sister of royal sister type. The man on the swivel chair looked at the woman with indifferent eyes, the corners of his mouth turned up, and said with a smile, "Goo ha 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 ha, ISS all Sunday, Cobra is leaving." "Okay." The woman nodded, looked at the man, and said with a smile, "I just left this morning, so I should be far away from Alabasta by now." Goo ha 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 ha. The woman looked at the man who was laughing wildly, a trace of disgust flashed in the depths of her eyes. But she has no ability to resist the man's decision. Goo ha 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 ha. If we lack weapons, we will give them. If we lack people, we will make those villages completely desperate, isn't that all right? The man stood up, walked to the window, looked at the huge crocodile swimming past the glass, opened his hands, and laughed. "Give them?" The man turned around, stared at the woman, and said indifferently, "Don't you think it would be very interesting for the citizens of this country to destroy this country with their own hands?" The woman paused slightly, and then said, "This time Cobra went to the World Summit, and only brought one guard with him, and there is one guard left. Is the plan still going on?" "Certainly. Of course I'll give it to them. Fewer weapons?" The woman looked at the man with surprise in her eyes. The woman was taken aback, then smiled and said, "It's okay. The scale is not small, but there are too few weapons, and some villages in the kingdom have not yet reached the point of complete despair, so the development is still not fast enough. The rebel army. Never mind." She shook her head, her goal was history, and she was incapable of managing the rest. The man laughed loudly, then lowered his head, looked at the woman and asked, "By the way, what happened to the rebel army formed by that boy named Kosha?" The man stared at the woman and said with a smile, "This time, while Cobra is not in the kingdom, we can send more people to the king's army, ha 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 ha." Chapter 92 Alabasta. Alabasta, a superpower located in the first half of the Grand Line, is a kingdom built in the desert, so it is also known as the Desert Kingdom. The island where it is located is one of the largest huge islands in the first half of the Grand Line. The kingdom of Alabas is very large and prosperous, but it is experiencing man-made natural disasters without anyone knowing. Since a year ago, the kingdom of Alboon, except for the capital Albana, has never had rain in the country. This can be said to be a disaster for the desert kingdom that is severely short of water. Due to the lack of supplementary water sources from the sky, some desert oases gradually dried up, which forced the civilians who lived on the oasis to move away from the oasis and move towards a larger oasis. Although it hasn't rained in the kingdom for more than a year, all the citizens still believe in the country and their king. And since only the capital, Alba, rains, the citizens attribute this phenomenon to their benevolent king, and trust their king even more. But an incident happened a few months ago that completely plunged the country into war. Rapeseed. The port city of Alabasta, rich in perfume. Early in the morning, Firebird took his 2 deputies and waited on the port pier outside the rapeseed flower. "Hey." The Firebird leaned back against the wall under the eaves of the porthouse, held a cigarette in his hand, stared at the distant sea, and sighed repeatedly. On his left, his 2 assistants were sitting on the rocks, arranging the package in front of him, which was full of things needed for photography. One of the assistants straightened up, holding the lens of the camera in his hand, and was wiping it. Hearing Firebird's sigh, he glanced helplessly at Firebird. "Boss, you've been sighing for days, it's time to cheer up." "What do you know?" Firebird raised the cigarette in his hand, opened his mouth to bite the cigarette holder, and took a deep puff. The shredded tobacco swirled in the lungs, passed through the windpipe, and rushed out of the nose. He turned his head to stare at the 2 younger brothers, and said harshly, "That's the battle of the world's top swordsmen. It's right in front of you." "It's right in front of my eyes, but I didn't take a picture." "Hey." After speaking, he lifted the cigarette, took a big puff, and sighed again. "You know that feeling?" "Do not know." The 2 little brothers shook their heads again and again. They used to work in all over the world, not to mention the world's top swordsmen. Even the swordsmen, they have never seen it, let alone shoot news. It was the same boy who was wiping the lens. He stopped his hands, threw the silk scarf back into the bag, then bent down to take out the camera from the bag, put the lens on, and said while looking at Firebird, "Brother, isn't the silver-haired brother coming soon? Can you just ask him when the time comes?" "Ask?" Advertisement. Firebird stopped smoking, stared at his younger brother with strange eyes. He complained in his heart, "Who do you think I am? Do you think I really have a good relationship with that silver-haired one? And ask, that's a super big pirate with a reward of 1.5 billion, aren't you afraid of death?" Not long after Sorata and the others left Lil Garden, the world government knew about them. The world government knew about them, and of course Morgans knew about them. So Firebird can also be said to be the first person to know the news of Sorata's reappearance. On the day he received the news from Morgans, he called Sorata and learned that Sorata and the others were going to Magnetic Drum Island first, and then directly to Alabasta. After calculating the flight time from Magnetic Drum Island to Alabasta, he immediately took his younger brother from the rainy land to the port city of Rapeseed Flower. But he calculated the day when Sorata and the others should arrive in El Laboon, but they didn't arrive. Let him wait for a day in vain. When he didn't see the Shadow of Liberty by the next day, he couldn't help but called Sorata again, and learned from the phone that Sorata had just finished fighting Hawkeye. This filled his heart with regret. Why didn't you go to Drum Island to meet Sorata after getting the news? Just when he fell into remorse again and couldn't extricate himself, his younger brother shouted loudly. Brother, look quickly, is that the silver-haired brother's boat? Where? Huo Nio quickly stood up straight, his spirit was shaken, his eyes followed the direction of his younger brother's finger, and looked at the distant sea. I saw it on the sea where the water and the sky meet. A small sailboat with a sheep's head is heading towards this side quickly. That's right. Firebird looked at Liberty's conspicuous sheep's head, his face was filled with excitement, and he was no longer as decadent as before. That's the silver-haired brother's boat, hurry up. He turned his head and said to the two younger brothers. Hurry up and pack up, let's go, follow me to meet the silver-haired elder brother and the others. As he spoke, he turned his head, raised his feet, and walked quickly towards the pier. He was going to meet Sorata himself. Thinking of the information he had collected in the past few months, his heart was agitated. This time, it must be another big news that shocked the world. The Bow of the Liberty. Sorata looked at the bustling city embedded in the golden desert in the distance, with a smile on his face. Finally reached, he turned his head, looked at the watchtower, and shouted, Allo. Exist. On the edge of the watchtower, Arlo stretched out his head and asked below, what's wrong? Advertisement. The flag can be put away. Receive the flag? Doubt flashed across Arlo's face. Okay. Sorata turned around, leaned back against the guardrail, looked at the flag fluttering on the top of the mast and said, we will stay in Alabasta for at least 4 or 5 days this time. If we don't take the flag away, I'm afraid our ship will be destroyed by other pirates or marine was taken away. After all, in this world, there are many people who don't know the heights of the heavens and the earth, and are not afraid of death. Oh. Arlo nodded, turned around, climbed to the top with his hands on the mast, and took down the flag. Before he got down, Sorata's voice came from below again. Being busy, let's put up the sails by the way, it's almost here anyway. To understanding, Sorata looked at the busy Arlo, turned around, lay on the guardrail, pulled off the wine gourd, and drank with her head up. Behind him, Kuina was wearing a short-sleeved t-shirt and shorts, her hair was tied into a ponytail, and she was lying on a deck chair, reading a newspaper. Putting down the newspaper, looking at the slowly rising sails, she took a sip of tea from the coffee table next to her, then stood up, walked to Sorata, lifted the sunglasses on her face, put them on her forehead, and lay on her stomach on the guardrail, looking at the port ahead. His eyes were full of curiosity. Winter Island has seen it. Hiroshima also saw it. Even Sha Dao has seen it. This is the first time they have seen the desert, the real desert kingdom. The weather around here is really nice. When they sailed near Alabasta, they didn't see a storm for a day, and it was basically sunny. But the good thing is that the further you go to Alabasta, the hotter and drier the weather will be. It is said that there has been no rain here for more than a year, and there is an extreme lack of water. I don't know how this country in the desert has spent more than a year. Thinking of this, she withdrew her gaze and turned to look at Sorata with tenderness in her eyes. Maybe that's why Sorata insisted on coming here. She knows that Sorata has many secrets. From the first day Sorata came to the sword gym, she knew it. Sorata always thought she didn't know. She and Sorata grew up together, and she paid close attention to Sorata. Sorata has read those newspapers and read those books, can she not know? But she never asked. She believed that Sorata would tell her if he wanted her to know, and if he didn't tell her, he definitely couldn't tell. Sorata does have a secret, a big one. But he never hides anything from Kuina, he will tell her what he can tell her. There's only one thing he might not tell Kuina until he dies. After all, time travel is too dreamy, it's better to rot in the stomach. Chapter 93 Dancing Fans. What's wrong? Sorata put down the wine gourd and turned to see Kuina staring at him in a daze. He stretched out his hand, touched his face, and said with a smile, is there a flower on my face? Look at it so seriously. Nothing. Kuina came back to her senses, the corners of her mouth turned up, and a smile appeared on her face. She turned her head, looked at the port in front, picked up the teacup, took a sip, and her eyes flashed with anticipation. Desert Kingdom. Must be very interesting, hee. The Liberty was not far from the port. After Arlo put away the sails, although the speed of the ship slowed down, under the inertia, it still slowly sailed into the port and stopped at the open space among several merchant ships at the dock. He will not park the boat in a deserted place like Juan Luffy and the others. That's why he asked Arlo to pull down the flag. He has no special affection for flags. In this way, they can enter and leave the regular port in a dignified way. As long as they go to the island and pay a little parking fee to the port guard, they don't have to worry about the ship anymore. There are guards, and it is impossible for ordinary people and pirates to drive away their ships. Before the ship stopped, the Firebird's shout came from the front of the Liberty. Silver-haired brother, Kuina big sister head, this way, this way. Yo, it's the Firebird. Sorata leaned forward, lying on the guardrail, looked down at Firebird and his two lieutenants, and greeted them with his hand. Haven't seen you for a long time, brother Silverhair, long time no see. Firebird looked at Sorata excitedly, shook his hands, and responded loudly. I said, what's wrong? Firebird lowered his hands and stared at Sorata suspiciously. Sorata rubbed his chin, looked around Firebird up and down, and said with a smile. You guys haven't seen each other for a few months, and you're still staying in this desert kingdom, and you've gained weight. Have it? Huo Nio hurriedly lowered his head and swept around himself, then turned to look at the two younger brothers, and asked, am I fat? The two younger brothers looked at the Firebird and nodded in unison. Boss, you are indeed much stronger than when we first met. Ha 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 ha, fat is fat, and I'm not someone who cares about my figure. Advertisement Firebird laughed loudly, turned his head to look at the Liberty that had come to a stop, and hurriedly walked onto the ship along the planks that had been lowered by the side of the Liberty. Watching the three of Ahua and Indigo come out of the cabin, Firebird hastily pulled the two younger brothers forward to say hello. Brother Luo, long time no see, you are getting more and more handsome, and Brother Dao is also getting more and more handsome. Seeing Indigo, Firebird quickly bowed and saluted, Hi, Dr. Indigo. Calical. Looking at Firebird, Indigo grinned and said with a smile, Mr. Firebird, how are you going these few months? As he said that, he laughed loudly, Calical. Seeing you like this, you must be living a good life. Calical. Hey. Maybe the food is better. Firebird looked at Indigo, patted it, and said with a smile that his belly was getting fatter. It's really a little fatter, hee. At this moment, Awa changed out of the chef uniform he usually wears on the boat, and walked out in a t-shirt and shorts with a big belly. Yo. Seeing the Firebird, he took a step forward, passed between Aluo and Adao, and greeted the Firebird with his hand. Isn't this our reporter Mr. Firebird? When did you come here? Hello brother Wa, long time no see, I was waiting for you at the pier early this morning. Oh. Ava nodded. Firebird's eyes swept over Ahua's body and stopped on Ahua's stomach. He exclaimed loudly, Brother Wa, you are getting stronger and stronger. Ha 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 ha, that's right, you don't even look at my reward. As he spoke, Awa patted his stomach, bang bang bang. Like playing the drums. Okay, let's go. Sorata stepped off the bow and stood by the side of the boat, looking at the bustling streets in the distance with a smile in her eyes. Due to its proximity to the sea, it may be Alabasta at this time, the only one of the three cities that has not been affected by the dry weather. The other two are Rainland, the lair of Shichibukai, Clocadar, and Albana, the capital of Alabasta. The rainy land, as the name suggests, never lacks water at all. There are rivers that never dry up all year round. Advertisement when other places are worrying about drinking water, in the casino rain banquet in the rainy land, Kalok Dale even used a lot of water to raise crocodiles. Large crocodile. On the bustling street, Sorata and his party are heading towards the clothing store. To travel in the desert, they are not in the same body. The desert is not only windy and sandy, but the temperature is extremely high during the day and extremely cold at night, so it is generally necessary to wear a coat. If you don't want to be sunburned, even your head should be covered with gauze. Of course, wearing a hat will do. Firebird. Adao reached out, took out the cigarette in his mouth, held it in his hand, and blew out a smoke ring in front of him. He watched them walking beside them, and introduced Alabasta to them, the Firebirds of various cities, and asked. Didn't you say that it doesn't rain in the whole kingdom? Why does it rain in Alba? No hurry, that's what I'm going to say next. Oh, Firebird stared at Indigo, with an inexplicable smile flashing in his eyes. Dr. Indigo, tell me why. Dancing fan. Calical, I know what a dancing fan is. Dancing powder is also known as powder calling rawn. Its appearance is a green powder. It was invented a long time ago by a country that does not rain. It can produce mist like smoke floating in the air, producing the so-called artificial rain. The origin of the name is to hope that the people will be able to celebrate the rain and dance happily. Everyone looked at the Firebird with curiosity in their eyes. 4 months ago, the dancing powder being transported to Albana was discovered here. As he spoke, he puffed out his chest and continued. We just arrived here. Within a few days, an incident happened at the position where I was standing, which shocked the whole Alabasta. It can also be said that it started from this incident. Alabasta really came under fire when things started. It's artificial rainwater. Firebird looked left and right, and his eyes stopped at the corner in front of him. He strode forward, stood in the middle of the road, and turned around. He didn't lower his head until Sorata and the others approached, and stepped on the ground with his heels. Aluo put his hands in his pockets and stood coolly on the side. Hearing this, he shook his head and said with emotion. Did the king of this country use this kind of dancing powder to make it rain in Albana? This is a good thing. It can rain. Why is it the fuse of the war? Artificial rain. Oh. What's the matter? He raised his head, met the curious eyes of the crowd looking at him, and said with a smile, I haven't come to Alabasta to travel these few months. Indigo stroked his chin and thought for a while, then laughed. Calcal, I think I know why it's only raining in Albana. Looking at the eyes of everyone looking over, Indigo explained. Amazing. Chapter 94. Eating a golden apple can live 1,000 years. Calical. Indigo looked at Arlo, and said with a smile. There is nothing in the world that can make rain out of thin air. These rains are formed by attracting clouds from other places, and then over-squeezing the water molecules in the clouds. So once this powder is used, Other places living downwind will suffer from drought. The country that first invented dancing powder used this powder excessively, which caused wars in the countries below. Finally, it was discovered by the world government and brought dancing powder is completely banned, not only prohibited to use, but also prohibited to manufacture. Oh, everyone nodded. Now I understand, is it the king of this country, for his own comfort, that's why he used this kind of dancing powder to rain in Albania, which made other places dry, and was discovered later, which made this the country is at war. Hey hey. Firebird laughed triumphantly, attracting everyone's attention. Seeing that everyone's eyes focused on him again, he smiled and said, Dr. Indigo's explanation of the dancing fans is correct, and the reason for the war is also correct, but there is one thing, I think you may have made a mistake. Wrong? Everyone stared at the Firebird for a moment. Let's go. Talk while walking, it's embarrassing to stand here. Sorata looked at the familiar golden apple on the side of the street, with the corners of her mouth turned up, and walked over. He knew everything Firebird said, but he knows that he knows it, but the partners don't know it. He can't deprive his friends of their curiosity. Okay. Huo Nio quickly turned around and continued to lead the crowd forward. Oh, brother, I haven't seen you. Is this your first time in Albus? In front of the apple stand, an old man with white hair and beard was standing. When the old man saw Sorata approaching, his eyes lit up, and he quickly raised the golden apple in his hand and introduced it loudly. Well, take a look, it's a golden apple. Oh, golden apples? Sorata looked at the apple in the old man's hand and reached out to touch it, but the old man took a step back and avoided it. The old man stood still, looking at Sorata with a smile on his face. Brother, this is a very precious secret treasure. Oh, the old man leaned forward and whispered to Sorata, I'll just tell you one thing. In fact, this is an incredible treasure I found in the ancient ruins. As he spoke, he reached out and patted Sorata's shoulder, turned his head to look at the golden apple on his right hand, and continued. This is a dreamy golden apple that can make people live for thousands of years with just one bite. Advertisement, golden apple? Live for 1,000 years? Sorata looked at the old man and said with a smile, Old man, is this really found in the ancient ruins? Yes, of course it is true, this is the legendary legacy of ancient civilization. Can it really make the person who eats it live for 1,000 years? Okay. The old man nodded, held the apple in front of Sorata and said seductively, I'm sure what I said is not wrong. That must be expensive. Sorata shook her head, turned around and wanted to leave. I'm sorry, sir, I must not be able to afford such an expensive thing, so I'd better go. The old man's hand holding the apple froze at Sorata. He looked at Sorata who was turning around, and quickly reached out to grab him and said, Guest, since you were so knowledgeable. Seeing Sorata stop, the old man let go of his hand quickly, frowned and thought for a while, then raised his head and smiled at Sorata. By the way, guests, now, I can give you a discount. Oh, a discount? Sorata turned around, looked at the boss and smiled, how much discount is that? The old man raised his hand and clenched it into a fist, then let go of his index finger and bounced. 100,000 berry. Sorata pretended to be shocked, and shook her head quickly, no, it's too expensive, I can't afford it, I can't afford it. Sorata's exaggerated movements left the old man speechless. He looked at Sorata, shook his head, and said loudly, Guest, this is not 100,000 berry, but 1,000 berry. 1,000? Yes, it's 1,000 berry. This golden apple, which can make people live for 1,000 years after one bite, is yours. As he spoke, he raised the apple to Sorata's eyes and said with a smile, How about it, guest, would you like one? Gudu. Sorata swallowed, looked at the apple in front of her eyes, greed flashed in her eyes. Seeing the greed in Sorata's eyes, the smile on the old man's face deepened. Looks like this order is done again, haha, however, while he was waiting for Sorata to agree to him so that he could complete the business. On the street ahead, a pink light rushed towards this side quickly. Standing behind the old man with his signature pink coxcomb head on his head, Firebird snatched the apple from the old man's hand before the old man had time to react. Advertisement, hey. What are you doing? The old man lost his hands and recovered his senses in an instant. He turned around, stared at the Firebird, and said loudly, Little rascal, I advise you not to meddle in your own business. When he saw Huo Niao's attire, he thought Huo Niao was a local, so he sternly threatened him. The golden apples he has sold in rapeseed flowers for so long, only the locals know that they are fake, and ordinary travelers don't know the real condition of his golden apples. Firebird ignored the old man, but quickly stepped forward and stood in front of Sorata. He bent down and said to Sorata, I'm sorry, brother silver-haired, I didn't find out in time, and I almost let you be deceived. Sorata looked at Firebird and shrugged helplessly. He stretched out his hand to support the Firebird and said with a smile, Okay, I'm just playing with this old man, what's the matter? As he spoke, he took the apple from Firebird's hand, walked to the old man, and then reached out and handed the apple to him. I'm sorry, Grandpa, although I really want to live 1,000 years, but I'm still young, what I think now is to live every day well. Seeing the bewildered old man who took the apple, Sorata tore off the wine gourd, raised her head and took a big sip. Sorata lowered her head, exhaled a refreshing breath of alcohol, turned her head to look at the Firebird who was stunned, raised her foot, and kicked his asterisk. What are you doing in a daze? Let's go. Oh, Firebird came to his senses and hurriedly followed. He stepped forward quickly, walked up to Sorata, turned his head to look at Sorata, and said with a smile. It turns out that the silver-haired brother has already found out that the old man is a liar. I must be stupid to run over to stop me so stupidly. Stupid isn't stupid. Really? Firebird paused, with a happy smile on his face. It's just that once you come, I lose a lot of fun. Sorata shook his head, held up the wine gourd and took a sip, then turned his head to the Firebird and said, by the way, where are they? Where are they all in the clothing store in front? Speaking of which, the Firebird hurriedly quickened his pace and walked in front of Sorata, leading the way for Sorata. Nonsense. The old man came back to his senses, looked at the two of Sorata who walked into the nearby clothing store, turned around, and spat on the ground. Poor. Then he quickly raised his head, with a smile on his face again, greeted the passing pedestrians loudly, and introduced his golden apple. Chapter 95 The Colored Camel. After buying and changing into Alabasta's unique clothes, Sorata and his party came to the place where the camels were rented. As soon as Sorata entered the door, he caught sight of a camel with its head held high. After talking with the boss, he couldn't wait to get on the camel, but was dragged by the camel and avoided it. Sorata's outstretched legs froze in the air, and he looked up at the camel that was looking at him sideways. The more he looked, the more familiar this guy looked. He retracted his legs and tried to say hello to the guy. Hi. The camel gave Sorata a disdainful look, its lips twitching. It's like saying, go away, man, the uncle only takes female passengers. It then raised its head, looked over Sorata, and looked at Kuina behind Sorata, with red hearts in its eyes. Excuse me, guest. At this moment, the boss who was accompanying Awa and the others to choose camels saw the situation and came over. He bent down and apologized to Sorata, then straightened up and looked at the camel in front of Sorata and said, this camel is a bit special, guest. As he said that, he turned his head and looked at Sorata embarrassedly. Why don't you choose another one? The boss can't help it either. Although this camel looks strong, it is actually a down-to-earth camel that only carries female passengers. How could there be so many female passengers in the desert? Grow so strong and eat so much. He was thinking about whether to sell the camel. Sold to the transport team. Sorata glanced at the boss, then looked up at the camel, the corners of her mouth twitching. He didn't expect the world to be so small. He didn't know if it was fate. Here, he unexpectedly met the color camel, Eyelashes, who played a large role in the original book. You are an animal. Why don't you go to the beauties in the camel world, but come to appreciate the beauties of humans? Don't know. Sorata looked away and shook her head. Then he waved his hand at the boss and said, boss, this is it. Guest. Without waiting for the boss to continue, Sorata continued. Needless to say, boss, I know the situation of this camel. No? The boss looked puzzled, turned his head and glanced at the camel, and then followed the camel's gaze to see Kuina behind Sorata with bright eyes. So there is a woman. The boss withdrew his gaze and said to Sorata, since the customer insists, let's go this way. I'll pick camels for other customers, and you continue. As he spoke, he shook his head, glanced at his eyelashes, and turned to Ahua and the others. He has already figured it out. After this business trip is over, he will definitely sell this camel. It will affect his tall and mighty, handsome flower, the most handsome persona. Seeing the boss leaving, Sorata turned around and waved to Kuina. Okay. Kuina also had a camel by her side, which she had just picked. Advertisement. Seeing that Sorata was calling her, she quickly put down the rein in her hand, answered, turned around and raised her feet, and walked towards Sorata. When she raised her head and glanced past Sorata and met the gaze of the colored camel, her footsteps froze slightly. She has seen this kind of gaze on people. But, she walked up to Sorata with a strange expression, looked at the camel and said, Sorata, what's the matter with this camel? How'd I feel? She looks at me with squinting eyes. Sorata didn't know how to say it either. Himkai. At this moment, the camel behind Sorata opened its mouth and let out a loud cry, with the corners of its mouth upturned, staring at Kuina, as if saying hello. Hi. Hello beauty. Under Kuina's gaze, it quickly walked up to Kuina and pressed its body to the ground. Then looked up at Kuina, head tilted to the back, lips squirmed. As if to say, beauty, come up, there's no more handsome camel than me here. Sorata turned to look at the color camel, the corners of her mouth twitched. This guy is too spiritual, such a human nature, but this level of lust is a bit unreasonable. He turned his head to look at Kuina with a bewildered expression and explained, this guy is actually a camel, and it only carries women, so you can sit on it. Himkai, just you, what is this if it's not S***X? Sorata turned her head, cast a dissatisfied look at the colored camel, and answered loudly. The camel's lips squirmed. Himkai, seeing it was about to spit at Sorata. At this time, Kuina took a step forward and reached out to touch the camel's head, good boy. The colored camel immediately quieted down, color camel. Sorata looked at the eyelashes, opened her mouth and muttered. Eyelashes ignored Sorata, rubbing his head in Kuina's hand, squinting his eyes in enjoyment. Kuina turned to look at Sorata, with the corners of her mouth upturned, her eyes narrowed into crescents, and said with a smile. Sorata, I think this camel is quite obedient. Of course it behaves well in your hands. Sorata tore off the wine gourd, raised her head, took a sip, and smacked her mouth. Sure enough, the taste of wine in each place is different. The wine here is not like Bath, nor like the Isle of the Drum. Since the wine here is brewed with groundwater, it has a unique sweetness of groundwater. It's just that the degree is a bit low, which doesn't meet his taste. He lifted the wine gourd over his head, blocking the sun, and looked up at the sky. The whole world is like a steamer, the air is distorted and hot. It's still a port city, so it's that hot, so what about the outback? Advertisement. He glanced at the sky, looked away, and shook his head. It's been a few hours since I came to the rapeseed flower, but I didn't see a cloud, which is really strange. He knew that Clockadar used dancing powder to rain in Albosta, the capital of Albosta, but he didn't expect the power of this thing to be so powerful. Actually, a city plundered the entire island, including the rainwater from the sea around the island. He doesn't know how it works. Come to think of it, it's the same as what Wong Luffy said. This is an incredible powder. After all, miracles are everywhere in this world, and everything that cannot be explained can be attributed to miracles, which is incredible. Himkai. When Kuina stepped on its back and sat down, the eyelashes stood up immediately, raised her head and gave a few cheers. Tread tat tat, standing still, a very happy look. Sorata put down her hand, glanced at her eyelashes, the corners of her mouth turned up, and a smile appeared on her face. This guy is so jubilant now, I'm afraid he will be sold to the transportation team by the boss here soon. He knew that this guy would be in the transportation team in the future. There are all supplies there, but it is not as easy as camel people. Thinking of this, the smile on his face grew even wider. Guests, the camels have all been selected. When you arrive at the rainy land, there will be someone who will collect the camels. Oh. Sorata withdrew her gaze, lowered her head, looked at the boss standing in front of her rubbing her hands, and said with a smile, "How much is it, boss?" 1 camel, 10,000 berry, there are 9 of you, so, 90,000 berry, right? The boss took berry, took the money with both hands, and said to Sorata while counting, "There is no such thing as easy money, it's just a little hard-earned money. Although the travel expenses are expensive, there is a reason why they are expensive, these camels, but they are all carefully selected by me. As long as there is no huge desert storm in the desert, they can safely send you to any place you want to go." Okay. After the boss counted the money, he took the money in one hand, waved it to Sorata, and put it in his pocket. Okay, guessed, 190,000. There was a loud shout from the boss. Sorata nodded, glanced at the people behind the boss who were all sitting on camels, took out a handful of berry from his arms, counted out 19 with the eyes of the boss shining, and handed it to the boss. "Boss, you are really earning money." The camel got up, walked out of the gate gradually, and headed for the desert in the distance. The boss shook his head and said to Sorata, "Guests, there is still a deposit of 100,000. Which is a total of 190,000 berry. When you return the camels in the rainy land, the people there will refund the deposit. Do not, guests, I wish you a pleasant journey and welcome to visit next time. It takes a little more than 2 days for the rapeseed to reach the rainy land. 2 days, 10,000 berry per person, it's not expensive, and it's cheap, of course, it's not cheap either. Behind. After all, it was an exclusive business, and the price was reasonable, not too outrageous." Sorata shook her head, turned around, and got on the camel that Kuina had chosen.